Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Before you drift off, it would be a nice idea if you could leave a comment to let me know where you are listening from. Please don't forget to give the video a like and subscribe to the channel. Right, let's get comfy and relaxed, and let's begin. Story 1, Shadows of the Hidden Rift. I never believed in anything like parallel worlds or alternate realities. Those ideas were the sort of stories you heard from late-night radio hosts or read in dusty paperbacks at the back of the library. Maybe the kind of thing that only creeps into your mind when you're too tired, or when the rain taps rhythmically against your window, and your thoughts start drifting in directions you would usually shut out. But that night, everything I thought I knew about reality shattered. It started just after midnight. I had been working late, alone in the office on the 14th floor of a downtown building. The kind of office where the hum of fluorescent lights and the clatter of keyboards usually drown out any sense that you're really somewhere. These places exist in a sort of limbo between day and night, where time becomes a dull, indistinct concept. I was finishing some reports when my computer screen flickered and then went black. That kind of power glitch wasn't unusual in the aging building, so I leaned back, blinking at the blank monitor. When the screen lit up again, the desktop looked different. The icons were rearranged, and some of the files I'd been working on were missing entirely. At first, I thought maybe the system had crashed or some update had reset my settings. But then I noticed my calendar was off by a week. The date was January 12th, but I was certain it was January 5th. I checked my phone. Same thing, January 12th. My watch too. I felt a sudden chill. I tried to call my wife, but there was no signal. The elevator didn't respond when I pressed the button. The only way down was the stairs. I grabbed my bag and headed for the stairwell. The corridors felt different, narrower somehow. The usual signage was gone, replaced by unfamiliar symbols etched into the walls. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting long shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. I told myself it was just my imagination. Maybe the stress was getting to me. I reached the lobby, but it wasn't what I remembered. The space was larger, the walls painted a deep red instead of the bland cream color I was used to. The reception desk was manned by a woman I had never seen before, though I was sure I'd passed through this lobby hundreds of times. When I approached, she smiled but didn't say anything. I tried to speak, but my voice sounded muffled, like it was coming from underwater. A sudden noise behind me made me turn. The exit doors weren't glass but heavy steel, bolted shut. I pressed my hands against them, but they didn't budge. Panic began to rise in my chest. I tried the phone again, still no signal. I walked back toward the stairwell, now desperate for some way out. On the second floor landing, I stopped. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, impossible to see where it ended. The carpet was soaked with a dark liquid, and the walls were covered in scratches, as if something had clawed at them. I wanted to call for help, but I was alone. The building felt alive in an unnatural way, as if it were watching me. I took a deep breath and started walking. Every door I tried was locked. Then, behind one, I heard whispering, soft, unintelligible voices that seemed to echo inside my skull. I pressed my ear against the door. The voices stopped. I stepped back, heart pounding. Suddenly, the stairwell door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and rattled the handle, but it wouldn't open. The lights went out, plunging me into darkness so complete it was as if the air itself had been sucked away. I fumbled for my phone, but the screen was dead. That's when it hit me. I wasn't in my reality anymore. Something had crossed over, or maybe I had slipped through some crack in the fabric of the world. The knowledge was terrifying, but I forced myself to keep moving, to find an exit, to find any sign of the life I knew. As I took a tentative step forward, the whispering started again, this time all around me. The voices weren't just voices, they were fragments of memories, feelings, moments from places and times I didn't recognize but somehow knew. Faces I had never seen flashed in the darkness, an old man with hollow eyes, a child laughing without sound, a woman reaching out as if for help. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. Was the building alive? Was it some trap? Or was it just my own breaking sanity playing tricks? Then, a door ahead creaked open, spilling a thin stream of pale light into the hall. I hesitated. The whispering ceased. I stepped toward the light, and as I crossed the threshold, the air shifted around me. The carpet was no longer soaked, the walls were plain again, the hallway short and familiar. I pushed open the next door and found myself back in the lobby, my lobby, the one I knew. The colors were normal, the reception desk empty. I ran to the elevator and pressed the button. It hummed to life. As the doors slid open, I glanced back at the lobby. For a fleeting second, the red walls reappeared, the woman at the desk smiled, and the whispers filled the air once more before everything snapped back to normal. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen. I don't even know why I didn't just leave. Instead, I looked at my phone again. January 5th. The date was right. The signal was back. But deep down, I knew the world had changed, at least for me. Or maybe I had changed. I've been careful since then, watching for cracks, for signs that the reality around me might shift again without warning. I don't know if I want to tell anyone what happened. Who would believe me? It sounds insane. But the thing I fear most is that one day, the world I know will vanish, and I'll be trapped in that other place forever, a place where nothing is certain, where reality itself is random, and everything familiar can twist into something terrifying without warning. And sometimes, late at night, when the lights flicker and the silence thickens, I swear I hear those whispers coming from just beyond the edge of my perception, calling me back. I woke up to the faint hum of the street below, though in any normal sense, it should have been morning. The window was cracked open, and a cold draft slipped in, slipping past my skin like a slow, deliberate touch. I blinked against the dim light filtering through the curtains, but the room felt off. The shadows in the corners weren't where I remembered them being when I'd gone to bed. The chair by the desk had shifted slightly. It was turned at an unnatural angle, as though someone had pulled it back and then left it there. I tried to sit up but found I was still tangled in my sheets. The familiar comfort of my mattress felt wrong, too hard, too thin, as if I'd been transported into a replica of my bedroom, a distorted version crafted from memory but missing the texture of reality. Panic was a slow burn that crept up my throat. I breathed in and out, telling myself I was awake, that I was in my own room. But the sense of wrongness only deepened. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed, and the floor felt colder than usual beneath my bare feet. I stood and looked around, my eyes adjusting to the faint light. Everything was there, the posters on the walls, the stack of books on the nightstand, the old record player in the corner, but the air was unnervingly still, as if time itself had thickened and slowed. My phone sat on the desk, screen dark. I walked over and picked it up. The screen lit up instantly, but the time was impossible, 3:47 a.m. I wasn't surprised. I had no memory of waking in the middle of the night. I glanced around again, no sound but the faint city hum. Then, I noticed the window was wide open, far wider than I had left it, and the cool breeze now felt like a whisper pressing against my skin. I tried to shake off the creeping unease. Maybe I'd just twisted in my sleep, the chair had fallen, and the open window was an accident. But the heavy feeling in my chest insisted otherwise. I moved toward the door to leave the room, but it didn't open. I pulled, pushed, but it was as if it had fused shut. I tried the doorknob several times, my heart picking up speed. The familiar hallway beyond was gone, The door now opened into the solid plaster wall of my room. I stepped back, heart hammering. This wasn't possible. A sudden memory flashed, something I'd read online about dreams so vivid they trap you, about false awakenings. But this didn't feel like a dream. It felt like reality was breaking down, peeling back layers until I was left exposed to something else. Something random. I closed my eyes tightly, hoping it was a trick, that when I opened them, the door would be where it belonged. When I opened them, the room was the same, but I noticed something new, a small, crumpled piece of paper on the floor where the door had been. I picked it up with trembling hands. Written in jagged, uneven letters was a line, "Reality is not guaranteed." The words sank in with terrible clarity. I dropped the paper and stumbled backward. I was alone, but the message felt like a warning or a taunt. I tried again to open the door. No luck. Then, I turned to the window. Maybe if I climbed out, I could get help. I pushed the window wider and looked down. The street below was empty, not a single car, no pedestrians, just the faint glow of streetlights casting long shadows. The city felt abandoned. I hesitated but climbed onto the sill. The cold bite of the metal frame was sharp against my skin. I was about to step out when the scene shifted abruptly. One moment I was balanced precariously on the windowsill, the next I was back in bed, tangled in sheets, morning light streaming in through the curtains. The clock on the nightstand read 7:03 a.m. Relief flooded me, maybe it had all been a nightmare. But then I noticed the paper again, lying on the floor beside my bed, the same crumpled note with the words "Reality is not guaranteed." I stared at it, my breath shallow. The line wasn't supposed to exist. I hadn't written it. No one had been here. My phone buzzed on the desk. I grabbed it, heart pounding, and saw a new message from an unknown number. "Welcome back. Are you sure this is your reality?" I dropped the phone. The screen went black. The walls around me began to shift subtly, the edges of furniture blurring and warping. I felt the floor tilt, the ceiling warp. The room twisted into something unrecognizable, then snapped back into place. My mind reeled. I realized then that I couldn't trust any of this. What I saw, what I heard, what I felt, none of it was certain. I sat down hard on the bed, hands shaking. The message was clear. Nothing I experienced could be taken for granted, and somewhere, some force was playing with my perception of reality like a child with a broken toy. I knew I had to get out of the room. But every attempt to move forward just reset me, sent me back to the beginning, like I was trapped in a loop where each iteration was slightly altered from the last. I closed my eyes again, willing myself to awaken somewhere else, anywhere else. When I opened them, I was not in my room but in a dim corridor that stretched endlessly in both directions. The walls were a dull gray, and the floor was cold concrete. I walked down the hall, my footsteps echoing loudly. No doors, no windows, no signs of life. Just the endless corridor and that oppressive silence. Then, without warning, the walls began to pulse, as if breathing. The lights flickered, and shadows danced at the edges of my vision. I spun around, but nothing was there. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. A voice whispered from the shadows, soft and cruel, "How long can you hold on to what you know?" I ran forward, desperate to escape the suffocating space. The corridor twisted and turned impossibly, leading me back to the same spot over and over. Panic surged through me. I was locked in a place where reality bent and fractured at will, where the familiar could vanish in an instant, replaced by something alien and hostile. I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The whispered voice circled me, impossible to pin down. Reality is not guaranteed. The words echoed in my mind like a curse. I forced myself to stand, wiping tears from my eyes. I had to find a way out of this hell, a way back to the life I once knew, grounded in something solid and true. But every step I took only reminded me that I was caught in a nightmare woven from the threads of randomness itself. As I marched down the endless corridor, I knew one thing for certain: the world I had trusted was gone, replaced by a shifting maze where any certainty was an illusion, and the only rule was that there were no rules at all. I woke to the faint hum of the city outside, but something was wrong. The room felt smaller than before, the ceiling lower, the walls closer. I blinked against the dim light filtering through the cracked blinds and sat up, trying to shake off the lingering fog of a restless sleep. The bedspread felt heavier than usual, almost suffocating. A cold sweat clung to my skin. I glanced at the clock on the nightstand. The numbers read 7:43, but the digits flickered, sometimes showing 3:47, then back again. That shouldn't have been possible. Time, in theory, was constant, yet somehow the world around me was shifting. I stood, my feet sinking into the threadbare carpet as if the floor were a thin layer over something fluid. The air seemed thick, and every breath tasted metallic, like I'd been breathing through a mask coated in rust. I moved toward the door, but before I could reach it, I heard a faint tapping from outside. It was irregular, desperate, like someone knocking their knuckles raw. I hesitated, heart tightening. The hallway beyond my room stretched unnervingly long, far longer than it ever had. The apartment building was ancient, but the corridor now seemed endless, a tunnel of peeling paint and flickering fluorescent bulbs that buzzed and sputtered. I opened the door slowly, peeking out. The hallway was empty, silent except for that persistent tapping, now coming from somewhere near the stairwell. I crept down the hall, each step echoing unnaturally loud. The further I went, the more distorted the space became. Doors warped into unfamiliar shapes, the cracked walls seemed to breathe, pulsing with a faint, eerie rhythm. At the stairwell, the tapping stopped. I leaned over the railing, looking down into the abyss. The stairs stretched into a black void, the bottom lost in shadow. I felt an inexplicable nausea rise in my stomach and pull back from the edge. Turning away, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the far end of the hallway, a shadow, flickering between shapes, like a broken hologram struggling to maintain its form. I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, exhaustion playing games with my mind. But the nagging feeling that the building itself was shifting around me refused to subside. Back in my room, I tried to steady my thoughts. I pulled out my phone to check the time and messages, but the screen displayed a jumble of symbols I couldn't decipher. The familiar icons were replaced by indecipherable glyphs that glowed faintly, pulsing softly like a heartbeat. A sudden noise shattered the silence, a low, guttural growl from inside the apartment. I froze. My eyes darted around the room. There was nothing there. No animal, no person. Just the weak glow of the broken street lamp outside casting long shadows across the floor. I reached for the lamp on the nightstand, but the switch didn't respond. The room sank deeper into darkness, the shadows stretching like fingers reaching for me. Then, the growl came again, louder and closer, but this time it was followed by a whispered voice. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was pleading, desperate. I backed toward the door, hands trembling. I fumbled with the lock, finally twisting it open and stepping into the hallway. The air was colder here, sharper. The walls rippled as I passed, like water disturbed by a stone. I kept moving, guided by the faint glow of the emergency exit signs. At the end of the corridor was the emergency exit door, but when I reached for the handle, it dissolved beneath my hand, leaving a cold void. I staggered back, heart hammering in my chest. Behind me, the shadows converged, coalescing into a figure. It was tall, indistinct, as if composed of smoke and static. Its eyes, if they could be called that, were glowing embers, burning with a silent fury. I turned and ran, not knowing where I was going. The hallway twisted and stretched, every step taking me further from reality. Doors opened into rooms I'd never seen, filled with impossible shapes and sounds. The floor beneath me shifted, sometimes solid, sometimes like sinking sand. I found myself in what looked like a living room, but the furniture was wrong. The couch was made of a strange synthetic material that pulsed like flesh. The television screen flickered with static that seemed to whisper my name. I closed my eyes, trying to shake the images, but when I opened them, the room had changed again. Now it was a kitchen, but the appliances were oversized, grotesque parodies of their real-world counterparts. The refrigerator groaned, the oven door flapped like a jaw. Panicking, I spun around and saw the shadow figure at the doorway, blocking my escape. Its presence warped the air, bending light and sound. I felt an unbearable pressure in my skull, as if my mind was being compressed, squeezed through impossible angles. In desperation, I lunged toward a window, throwing myself against the glass. It shattered, shards raining down, but instead of falling, I found myself suspended in darkness. The world around me disintegrated, and I was floating in an endless void. The shadow figure hovered nearby, silent, watching. Then, a sudden pull like a string yanked tight dragged me back into the apartment. I landed hard on the floor. The room was calm again, the walls normal, the light steady. I lay there, gasping, drenched in cold sweat. The clock on the wall ticked normally. My phone screen was clear. It was over. Or so I thought. As I sat up, a soft tapping began again, this time from inside the room. Slowly, I turned toward the source. The mirror on the wall rippled like water. A dark face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. It smiled, but the smile was wrong, too wide, too sharp. I stumbled backward, heart racing. The reflection stayed, grinning. The room shifted once more, the air thickening, the walls breathing. I realized then that the world I knew was slipping away, folding in on itself. Reality wasn't fixed, it was random, unpredictable, a maze of shifting truths and lies. And I was trapped inside it. I didn't know how much time passed before I found myself standing in the hallway again, the tapping now all around me, echoing from every direction. There was no escape, only the endless, twisting corridors of a reality that refused to stay still. I had to keep moving. But no matter which way I turned, the shadow waited, and the mirror smiled. I woke to the low hum of the city outside my window, but something was off. The air felt thick, too quiet despite the usual buzz beneath the streetlights. My head throbbed, like it had been squeezed tight, and when I moved to sit up, the room swayed slightly, as though I'd been spinning in place. I blinked hard, trying to gather myself, but the edges of the window frame seemed to ripple, the glass bending in and out like a slow wave. I rubbed my eyes and swung my legs over the bed, but the floor beneath my feet felt wrong. The carpet was different, thinner, less worn, and the color was off, more muted than I remembered. I glanced around the room. Nothing else looked familiar. The dresser was in the corner where I'd never put it, and the posters on the wall were all different. One was a surreal painting of a twisted tree, its branches tangled like veins, and another showed a cityscape I didn't recognize, under a sky swirling with purple clouds. I pinched myself, desperate to prove this was a dream, but the sting was sharp and real. The hum from outside grew louder, but it wasn't the usual city noise. It was a distorted, layered sound, sirens that bent and stretched, voices that echoed too close, too distant. I tried to steady myself and find my phone, but the bedside table was empty. A thin pulse of panic hit me. I had no idea where I was or how I'd gotten there. The last thing I remembered was sitting on the couch, reading, waiting for the rain to stop. Now, I was trapped in this shifting room, and something about the air made me uneasy, like I wasn't alone. I moved toward the door, needing to get out, to find someone who could explain this. The hallway beyond looked familiar, but wrong, like an old photograph that had been retouched. The walls were painted a dull gray instead of the warm cream I'd chosen, and the light bulbs flickered unevenly, casting more shadows than light. As I stepped forward, the floor groaned beneath me, but with an odd hollow sound, as if it were empty underneath. I reached the stairwell and started down, hoping for the lobby or the street outside. But the stairs felt endless. With each step, the wall seemed to stretch taller, the ceiling arching upward like the inside of a cathedral. The fluorescent lights buzzed erratically, and I thought I caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, fast, low, just out of clear view. My heartbeat quickened, but I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light and my own fear. At the bottom, I pushed through the exit door and stepped outside. The night was different here. The sky was a murky shade of green, and the streetlights cast pale blue halos around them. Cars passed by, but their shapes were blurred, as if someone had smeared the edges with a brush. People walked past, but their faces were obscured, like static on a bad television signal. I called out, my voice sounding strangled in the thick air. No one responded. I tried my phone again. The screen lit up, but with a single word blinking in the center, error. No signal, no messages, no contacts. I started walking toward what I hoped was the city center, my mind racing to make sense of any of this. In the distance, a clock tower chimed, but the sound was wrong, offbeat and distorted, like a broken music box. As I moved, the world around me shifted again. Buildings melted into one another, their edges blurring. Windows turned into doors and then back into windows. Shadows stretched and contracted like breathing creatures. I stopped at a street corner and looked down at my hands, willing myself to stay calm. The skin looked normal, but the veins beneath the surface pulsed visibly, as if something alive was moving inside me. I closed my eyes for a moment, but when I opened them, the street had changed entirely. Now, the pavement was cracked and overgrown with weeds, and the streetlights were rusted poles with no bulbs. I turned around, but the direction I'd come from was gone, replaced by an alley shrouded in thick fog. A faint scent of rot and damp earth drifted toward me, making my stomach churn. I hesitated but felt compelled to enter, hoping to find something, anything, that would anchor me back to reality. Inside the alley, the fog thickened, and the air grew colder. I could hear the soft scrape of footsteps behind me, but when I spun around, nothing was there. My breath came out in light puffs, though the night had never been this cold before. The walls here were covered in crude graffiti, but the symbols didn't make any sense. They twisted and writhed like living things. Suddenly, a voice whispered from just behind me. It was faint and fragmented, like a radio tuning between stations. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was urgent, pleading. I called out, but the voice stopped. Silence swallowed the alley. I hurried forward, desperate to escape, but the alley seemed to stretch endlessly. The fog thickened into a solid wall ahead, and as I reached out to push through it, the world shuddered violently. For a moment, everything froze. The fog, the sounds, the air itself, as if time had been paused. Then, with a rush, the scene snapped back into motion, but nothing was the same. I was back in my apartment, sitting on the couch exactly as I had been before all this started. The rain pattered against the window, the soft glow of the street lamp outside casting familiar shadows on the walls. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, and for a moment, I thought it was all a nightmare. But when I reached for the phone, the screen showed the same word as before, error. I sat there, the hum of reality settling around me, more fragile than ever. Somewhere between moments, between what was and what wasn't, the world had fractured. I didn't know if I would ever find my way back to the life I remembered, or if it even existed anymore. The morning light filtered through the cracked window pane, slicing thin beams across the peeling wallpaper and the disheveled sheets I had abandoned hours before. I blinked against the sudden brightness, the memory of last night's chaos pressing against my skull like a dull ache. I remembered vaguely the way the room had shifted around me, the way the walls had breathed and warped as if the house itself were alive and trying to squeeze me out. I sat up slowly, cautious. The air still smelled faintly of damp earth and dust, but beneath that was something else, something metallic and sharp. My throat tightened, and the taste of copper lingered on my tongue. Had I bitten my cheek in my sleep? Possibly. The recurring strange sensations made me question the plausibility of everything, but I forced myself to focus on the tangible, the room, the window, the floorboards creaking under my feet as I moved to stand. The house was silent now, but the silence felt oppressive. I felt watched, though there was no one here. I ran my fingers along the cracked windowsill and noticed a thin layer of frost on the glass. Frost in April? That was impossible. Confused, I looked outside. The world had shifted. The trees were bare, shivering under a pale gray sky, their branches resembling skeletal fingers clawing at the cold, brittle air. I had no recollection of the night had been that cold. I swallowed hard, fighting a rising panic. The last thing I wanted was to lose grip on what little sanity I had left, but the evidence was undeniable. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and the seasons seemed to have tangled themselves up in a grotesque knot. I caught my reflection in the broken mirror across the room. The face looking back at me was pale, eyes sunken with exhaustion. I noticed the bruises forming under my cheekbones and the fresh cuts on my wrists that I didn't remember getting. Had I really been sleepwalking? Or had the house done something worse? I decided to check the calendar on the kitchen wall. My footsteps echoed hollowly as I crossed the creaking floorboards, every sound amplified in the stillness. The calendar was torn and stained, but the date was legible, April 12th. That was correct. But then, the pen beneath the calendar caught my eye. It was uncapped, and the ink had bled across the newspaper clipping beneath it, a clipping I was sure hadn't been there before. Curious, I read the headline, "Local Man Disappears Without a Trace." The photo was grainy, but the man looked vaguely familiar. I squinted at the name, Mark Holloway. No, that wasn't right. I didn't know anyone by that name. Yet I felt a strange pull, a vague connection that prickled along my spine. I flipped the clipping over and found a hastily scrawled note on the back, "He is still here." My heart hammered. Who was he? And why was that note here, now, when I had been alone all night? I glanced around the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed quietly, but the magnets on the door were different from how I remembered them. Photos I didn't recognize, dates I couldn't place, names I had never heard whispered from anyone's lips. I tore the magnets away, one by one. Beneath each was a set of numbers, cryptic and jumbled, not a phone number or address, but something else entirely, something like coordinates. My chest tightened as I felt the walls close in. The house was trying to communicate, to tell me something. But what? And why now? I heard a soft scraping sound from the living room. It was faint, almost like a whisper sliding across the floor. My pulse quickened as I moved toward the noise, every instinct screaming to run back to my room and lock the door. But I couldn't ignore it. Something was beckoning me, drawing me in. The living room was bathed in shadows, the only light coming from the flickering flame of the fireplace. But the fire was unlit. The glow was unnatural, casting long, shifting shapes on the walls, the shapes of people, or maybe memories. I blinked, and the shadows shifted, rearranging themselves into a twisted, grotesque tableau. A woman stood in the center of the room, her face obscured by tangled hair. She raised one hand, beckoning me closer. The air grew thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. My legs moved of their own accord, drawn forward despite my terror. As I stepped closer, the woman's features began to resolve. It was me, but not me. A version of me worn thin, hollowed out by years of silence and fear. Her eyes, dark and void, locked with mine, and I felt a coldness seep into my bones. Then the room shifted again. The woman disappeared, replaced by a child, a boy, no older than 5, with wide eyes and a trembling lip. He looked at me with a mixture of hope and despair. "Find him," the boy whispered, voice barely audible over the crackling silence. "Find him before he forgets." "Who?" I asked, but my voice was swallowed by the room. The boy vanished, and in his place, the fireplace erupted in flames. The heat was real now, scorching my skin and sending me stumbling backward. The room warped, the walls breathing and bending like waves on a stormy sea. I covered my face as the voices began, soft, distant, unintelligible at first, growing louder and more insistent. They were memories, or maybe echoes, fragments of realities that didn't belong to me. Images flashed behind my eyelids, a man drowning in a river I had never seen, a woman crying in a room that wasn't mine, a door slamming shut on a world I didn't recognize. I sank to the floor, gasping for air, feeling the line between what was real and what was not dissolve like mist. When I finally opened my eyes, the room was still. The fire was gone, the shadows retreated, and the silence returned, heavier than before. I knew then that the house was a nexus, a place where realities collided and overlapped at random. I was trapped between versions of myself, versions of people I didn't know but felt I should. The calendar, the clipping, the cryptic numbers, they were all pieces of a puzzle I had no hope of solving alone. But I couldn't give up. Somewhere in this tangle of realities was a truth I needed to find, a key to escape this nightmare. And I had to find him, the man, whoever he was, before I forgot who I was, too. The morning waned, the sun dipping low beneath the horizon. I sat back against the wall, trembling, clutching the newspaper clipping like a lifeline. Outside, the wind whipped through the bare branches, carrying with it whispers that promised answers and perhaps the end. I closed my eyes and whispered a vow to myself: I would find him, no matter what it took. Story 2, Veil of the Forgotten Veins. I never thought much about the randomness of life until that night. It was the kind of evening you'd usually forget by morning, but somehow, it clung to me like a shadow, impossible to shake. The city was alive, breathing through its neon veins, the usual cacophony of traffic and distant sirens humming under a sky mottled with clouds that hid the stars. I was just walking home from the late shift at the diner where I worked, the familiar ache of fatigue settling into my bones, when the world decided to slip its moorings. At first, it was subtle. I was crossing the street at the corner near the old cinema, the one that had been shuttered for years, its marquee letters hanging crookedly, spelling out nonsensical fragments. The air had a strange thickness to it, like the atmosphere was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I glanced up, catching a glimpse of my reflection in a cracked window pane, and for a second, the face staring back didn't quite look like mine, just a flicker, a glint of something wrong behind my eyes. Then, the sidewalk beneath my feet shifted. It wasn't a tremor or an earthquake, it was more like the ground had momentarily lost its shape. The concrete seemed to ripple, distorting the lines of the pavement, and for a heartbeat, I felt unmoored, like I was balancing on the edge of a dream. I stumbled but caught myself, looking around to see if anyone else noticed. No one did. People passed by, heads down, earbuds in, oblivious. I chalked it up to exhaustion. But as I continued walking, the city around me began to change in ways that no one else seemed to perceive. Storefronts altered mid-step, signs flipped from English to other languages and then back again. The streetlights dimmed and brightened at random, casting long shadows that didn't match any object. The sequence of traffic signals grew erratic, creating moments of surreal stillness where vehicles paused in impossible alignments, like a tableau frozen by an invisible hand. I tried to focus on something solid, anything familiar. The smell of exhaust fumes, the distant wail of sirens, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Yet, even those sensations became unreliable. Then I caught sight of a man standing alone on the corner ahead. He was dressed in an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd expect to see in black and white photographs. His face was obscured by darkness, but his posture was rigid, unmoving, as though he were waiting for something or someone. I slowed down, curiosity mingling with an uneasy sense of dread. As I approached, the street around him flickered like a faulty television signal, revealing glimpses of places that didn't belong to this city at all. One moment, I saw a dense forest with towering trees bathed in twilight. The next, the barren remains of a war-torn street. The man's figure seemed to stretch and compress, warping only to snap back to normal when I blinked. I called out to him, voice surprisingly steady despite the rising panic. He didn't respond. Instead, he lifted a gloved hand and pointed down the street behind me. I turned instinctively, heart pounding. The street behind had twisted impossibly. Familiar buildings were replaced by unfamiliar ones, painted in colors that burned too brightly. The sky overhead had shifted to a deep, unnatural purple. For a moment, I thought I might be hallucinating. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog of fatigue and fear. When I looked back, the man was gone. I considered heading home, but my feet moved in the opposite direction, drawn forward by a compulsion I didn't understand. The city continued to warp around me. Storefronts melted into each other, blending different architectural styles in jarring combinations. The soundscape fractured, the honk of a horn overlapped with distant laughter and cries I couldn't place. A sudden gust of wind carried a whisper, a voice just beyond hearing, threading through the chaos. I strained to catch it, but it dissolved before I could grasp a word. At one point, I found myself standing in front of a building I was sure hadn't existed before. It was a small museum or gallery, its glass doors pristine and unblemished despite the general decay of the neighborhood. The sign read simply, "The Archive." Intrigued, I stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, with rows of filing cabinets and shelves crammed with dusty books and strange artifacts. The air smelled faintly of old paper and something metallic, like blood or rust. In the center of the room stood a large table covered with photographs and documents, all of them unfamiliar yet eerily personal. I picked up a photograph and my breath caught. It was an image of me standing in places I'd never been, wearing clothes I'd never owned. The dates scribbled on the back didn't make sense. Some were from years before I was born, others dated decades into the future. A low hum filled the space, growing louder until it was a deafening roar inside my head. The walls seemed to pulse, the air thickening until I felt as if I were drowning in sound and sensation. Panic flared. I dropped the photograph and backed away, bumping into a metal cabinet that clattered loudly. The noise snapped the spell. The humming stopped abruptly. The lights flickered and then steadied. I looked around, everything seemed normal again. The photographs lay scattered on the floor, but the feeling of wrongness lingered like a stain. I didn't know what the archive was or why it had appeared, but I was certain of one thing: my reality was no longer reliable. The city I thought I knew had fractured, splintered into versions overlapping and bleeding into each other without warning. I was trapped somewhere between these shifting layers, a stranger in what should have been my own world. I left the museum, stepping back onto the street. The man in the suit was nowhere to be seen. The night pressed down, thick with unseen threats. Every shadow seemed to twist, every sound carried a hidden meaning. I wanted to run, to escape the madness creeping into my bones, but my feet refused to move faster than a cautious shuffle. It was then I realized that the randomness wasn't just in the world around me, it was inside me, too. My memories flickered like faulty film reels, images overlapping, moments forgotten and replaced with others that didn't belong. I questioned whether my own identity was stable or if I, too, was a shifting fragment in this fractured reality. I kept walking, unsure where I was headed. The night was far from over, and the city's secrets were only beginning to unravel. I woke up with a start, the weight of something wrong pressing down on my chest. The room was dark, the faint glow of streetlights through the blinds casting long shadows on the wall. For a moment, I couldn't remember where I was. The air smelled stale, like a room long closed off. I sat up slowly, heart hammering, trying to shake off the strange feeling that had settled over me the night before. The events of yesterday played back in my mind, fragmented and disjointed. The way the sky had suddenly shifted from bright afternoon blue to a hazy, sickly yellow without warning. How the faces of the people on the street had flickered, not like a trick of the light, but like a glitch in something I didn't understand. I had told myself it was stress, dehydration maybe. But deep down, I knew something was off. Reality itself seemed unstable, as if the world might unravel at any moment. I swung my feet onto the cold floor and stood. The apartment felt unfamiliar, even though I knew every creak and crack of the old building. I walked to the window and looked out. The street below was empty. Too empty. The usual clatter of cars, distant conversations, the hum of life, the absence was palpable. I strained to hear anything but the silence pressed against the glass. My phone was on the nightstand, screen cracked from a previous clumsy fall. I picked it up and checked the time, 4:17 a.m. The battery was nearly dead, but there was one new message. It was from an unknown number. The text read, "They're watching. Don't trust the shadows." I froze. Who would send such a message? Was it a prank? Or some kind of warning? My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitant to type back. Before I could decide, the screen flickered, then went black. A sudden chill swept through the room, and the hairs on my arms stood up. It felt like I wasn't alone. I turned toward the door. The lock was still engaged. The silence was overwhelming, but then, from the hallway just outside, I heard a faint scraping noise. Like nails on wood, but slower, deliberate. My breath hitched. I pressed myself against the wall, heart pounding in my ears. The sound stopped. Then something else, footsteps. Slow, uneven, as if whatever was out there staggered or hesitated. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe too loudly. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps retreated. The scrape of nails reversed, pulling away from the door. Then silence again. I waited until the first rays of dawn began to seep through the curtains before I dared to step outside my room. The apartment was eerily quiet. Everything seemed the same, yet different. The furniture was in the same place, the dishes in the sink, the newspaper folded on the table, but there was a subtle shift, like a half-remembered dream. The words on the newspaper headline blurred and reformed as I looked at them. Reality bends and citywide phenomenon became city empties as unknown presence looms. I blinked hard. Had I imagined it? I reached out and touched the paper. The ink was wet. Fresh. The date was today. I dropped the paper and moved to the window again. The street was still empty. But then, movement caught my eye across the street. A figure stood in the shadow of a lamppost. They didn't move, didn't blink. Just stood. Watching. I grabbed my jacket and headed downstairs, desperate for answers. The elevator was broken, as usual, so I took the stairs, each step echoing loudly in the empty stairwell. When I reached the lobby, the front doors were ajar, swinging slightly in the morning breeze. Outside, the world looked normal. For a moment, relief washed over me. I stepped out onto the sidewalk. The air was crisp but carried an edge of something metallic, like blood or rust. The streets were deserted, the silence uninterrupted except for the distant ringing of a church bell. Yet the feeling that I was being watched persisted, prickling my skin. I turned my gaze across the street, but the figure I had seen was gone. I walked down the block, past the shuttered shops and empty benches. A newspaper dispenser lay overturned, pages scattered like leaves. I picked one up. The headline was unfamiliar, the printed jumble of letters that rearranged themselves every time I looked away and back. I walked further, my footsteps the only sound in the silent city. The randomness of what I was seeing started to grow. A parked car's license plate changed numbers as I passed. A street sign flickered between names, Maple then Oak then Pine, none consistent. The buildings themselves seemed to pulse subtly, as if breathing. My mind raced, trying to ground myself. Was I hallucinating? Was this some kind of psychotic break triggered by stress? Or was reality itself fractured, splintered? I stopped in front of a cafe, its windows opaque with grime. I pressed my hand to the glass. The interior was dark, but the chairs moved slightly, as if caught in a breeze. I shook my head and turned away. A sudden noise behind me made me spin around. A man stood there, thin, pale, wearing a threadbare coat. His eyes were too bright, almost glowing in the dim light. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "You don't belong here," he said, voice low and gravelly. I wanted to ask who he was, what he meant, but the words stuck in my throat. "Everything's shifting," he continued. "You feel it. The cracks. The fractures. You're not crazy, but you're not safe." I took a step back. "What do you want from me?" He shook his head, eyes darting nervously down the street. "Watch the lines. Watch the spaces between moments. They're opening. And something is coming through." Before I could respond, he turned and vanished into the fog that had begun to roll in, thick and choking. I stood there, heart racing, unsure if I had spoken with a man, a ghost, or my own unraveling mind. The city was changing around me, random moments skipping and looping like broken film. I realized then that whatever was happening wasn't just to me. The world had fractured, and I was caught in the shards. I had to find out why. I had to understand what was breaking reality, and if there was any way to put it back together before it consumed me entirely. I woke up to the rustling of leaves outside the window, though I had no memory of falling asleep. The room was unfamiliar, a peeling wallpaper of faded green, an old wooden dresser with a cracked mirror reflecting a face I recognized, but that didn't feel quite right. My heart hammered as I realized I was no longer in my apartment, nor anywhere I'd been before. The bed creaked beneath me, coarse sheets tangled around my legs. I was somewhere else entirely. The window was open to a chilly, damp morning. Outside, the sky was an angry gray, the trees swaying as if blown by an invisible wind. I pulled myself upright, trying to steady my breath. My phone on the nightstand showed the time as 7:13 a.m., but the date was nonsensical, month 13, day 42. The numbers blurred and shifted as I stared. I tried to recall how I'd gotten here. The last thing I remembered was leaving my apartment to pick up groceries, the air thick with the usual city noise and the smell of rain that hadn't yet fallen. Then, nothing. Just a sudden flash, like a shutter snapping inside my mind. Now, this room. This place. The walls seemed alive, the shadows stretching and shrinking as though breathing. I rubbed my eyes, hoping to shake off the hallucination, but the feeling lingered. The mirror caught my attention again. My reflection blinked, but the eyes staring back were slightly off, too wide, the irises flickering with an unnatural shimmer, like a broken television screen. I shuffled to the door and opened it cautiously. The hallway outside was dim and smelled of mildew. Flickering bulbs overhead cast uneven pools of yellow light. As I stepped out, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, the sound somehow too loud in the oppressive silence. I moved down the hall, trying to find an exit. Doors lined both sides, some ajar, others shut tight. Peering into the open rooms, I saw mundane scenes: a kitchen with pots hanging from hooks, a living room cluttered with dusty newspapers, but none felt real or inviting. Each seemed frozen in time, objects suspended in awkward mid-motion. A teacup hovered an inch above a table, trembling gently, as if caught between states. The further I walked, the more disorienting the place became. The corridors twisted without logic, curving back on themselves in impossible ways. When I thought I'd reached the end, I found myself back near my room. The layout didn't obey any spatial rules I recognized. Panic set in, tightening my chest. I tried calling my phone again, but it showed only static. No signal. I considered yelling, but the silence swallowed my voice before it left my throat. I sat on the dusty carpet, head in my hands, trying to piece together what was happening. The word random drifted through my thoughts, an echo from last night's conversation with my friend Mark about that strange news story: people vanishing, reappearing in places they'd never been, worlds shifting beneath their feet. At the time, I dismissed it, but now, it felt eerily familiar. Suddenly, a low, guttural noise came from down the hall. I froze. It was a sound like a slow, dragging breath, uneven and harsh. I strained to listen, the hair on my arms rising. Another noise from behind a door creaked, then slammed shut with a final, decisive thud. My pulse raced. I stood and moved toward the source, the floor groaning beneath me. The corridor ahead was empty, but the air tasted metallic, sharp. I stopped in front of a door with peeling white paint. The knob turned under my hand, cold and sticky. As I pushed it open, the room revealed itself, a child's bedroom, but stripped of warmth. The bed was a bare frame, the blanket missing, and the walls were scrawled with frantic black lines that looked like scratches. The room felt charged, as if holding its breath. Then I noticed the small wooden box on the dresser. I opened it carefully. Inside, a collection of old photographs, their edges charred. The images shifted intermittently, faces blurred, replaced by strange geometries and twisting shapes that seemed to pulse before settling back into clarity. One photo drew my eye, a picture of me, standing in this very room, though I had no memory of ever being here before. Behind me, shadows gathered, dark and formless, pressing just beyond the frame. A cold wave passed through me. I shut the box and backed out, the door creaking shut behind me. Suddenly, the hallway shifted, walls trembling and then collapsing inward like waves, swallowing the light. I stumbled back as the floor disappeared, plunging me into darkness. When I landed, it was on something soft and cold. I lay there breathless, then opened my eyes to find myself in a vast, gray plain stretching endlessly beneath a heavy sky. There was no wind, no sound, only the dull throb of my own heartbeat. I looked down at my hands. They were blurred at the edges, the lines of my fingers fading and reforming like ink in water. I tried to call out, but my voice was swallowed by the emptiness. Then, without warning, the ground beneath me rippled like the surface of a pond. Shapes emerged, faces, places, moments, snippets of memories, both mine and not mine. A stranger's laugh, a crowded room, a forest burning, a whispered warning. Everything felt disjointed, as if reality itself was a fractured mirror, each shard reflecting a different possibility, slipping and sliding at random. Somewhere in the distance, I heard a single word, barely audible but unmistakable: remember. I forced myself to stand, each step uncertain, the world blurring and stabilizing with every breath. I needed to find a way out, to anchor myself. But the more I tried to grasp onto anything stable, the more it slipped away. I thought of the apartment I'd left behind, the streets I once walked, the life that now felt like a dream. Was this punishment? A curse? Or some cruel cosmic joke? I had no answers. Only the unsettling certainty that reality was no longer a constant, but a variable, shifting in unpredictable ways. And somewhere within this chaos, a terrifying intelligence watched, waiting for me to break. The sky darkened further, and the shapes around me began to twist into something monstrous, figures with too many limbs and eyes that burned like coals. I ran, though I had no idea where I was going, only that standing still meant being consumed. And as the darkness closed in, I whispered back to the void, I won't forget. I can't. Because if I do, I'm lost forever. The night after I found the journal, I refused to go back to my apartment. The idea of sleeping in that cramped, shuttered box felt suffocating. Instead, I wandered the streets until dawn, clutching the worn leather-bound book like a talisman against the creeping cold. Every few steps, my eyes flicked behind me, half expecting to see those shadowy figures from the subway platform again, but the streets were empty, save for the usual stray cats and the occasional drunk stumbling home. When morning finally stretched pale fingers across the sky, I returned to my place, unlocking the door with trembling hands. The apartment smelled stale, coated in a thin layer of dust despite my recent cleaning. I set the journal on the kitchen table and sat opposite it, forcing myself to read more, though every word seemed to curl tighter around my nerves. The entries chronicled the writer's descent into madness, or at least, what felt like madness from my perspective. They described waking up in different places, sometimes rooms that hadn't existed the day before, or outdoors in weather that didn't match the season. The disjointed memories, the unexplainable shifts in surroundings, it all echoed my own fractured experiences. But the part that unsettled me was the randomness of it all. There was no pattern, no logic. One minute, the writer would be sitting at their desk, and the next, they'd find themselves in a forest clearing with no recollection of arriving there. Sometimes people appeared, strangers dressed oddly or speaking languages they didn't understand, and then vanished without a trace. The writer called it random reality, as though their world was a dice roll, the outcome a different version of existence each time. I closed the journal, the weight of it pressing down like a second skin. I wanted to believe it was fiction. I wanted to believe I was just losing my mind, that the weird happenings were hallucinations, stress-induced, or some strange side effect of sleep deprivation. But deep down, I knew this was something else entirely. I decided to test it. If reality was truly random, perhaps I could find some way to predict or control it. I needed to observe the shifts carefully, to find a pattern, any pattern. I started a log on my phone, noting every anomaly, time skips, sudden changes in location, odd sensations. I paid attention to the environment, to sounds, smells, even the quality of light. The first few hours were uneventful, but then, at exactly 3:17 p.m., the world blinked. One moment I was sitting at the cafe across the street, sipping bitter coffee and scribbling notes in the journal. The next, I was standing alone in a narrow alleyway bathed in orange streetlight. The smell of damp brick and rotting garbage filled the air. My phone was still in my hand, the screen cracked. I looked around, heart hammering, but the alley was empty. The shadows stretched long, but didn't seem to move. I checked the phone, no signal. The date was the same, but the time read 2:43 a.m. How was that possible? The sun outside was high, but the phone said night. My skin prickled with cold dread. I tried to retrace my steps, but the exit I'd come through was gone. The alley twisted and turned, leading me deeper into a labyrinth of brick walls and flickering neon signs that buzzed faintly. I called out, but my voice sounded distant, swallowed by the oppressive silence. Minutes or hours passed, I couldn't tell, when the world blinked again. I was back at the cafe, coffee cold and untouched on the table. My journal lay open, the page I'd been writing on smeared with ink. My hands shook violently, and I fought the urge to scream. This was no hallucination. No trick of the mind. The randomness was real, uncontrollable, and terrifying. I kept my log updated, capturing every detail. Sometimes I'd blink into strange places, a dilapidated playground overgrown with weeds, an indoor pool filled with murky water, a city street from a decade ago, abandoned and cracked beneath a pale sky. Each time, I was alone, but I felt watched. The people from the journal's entries, those fleeting shadows and ghostly strangers, started to appear in my random jumps. They never approached me directly. They observed from a distance, their faces obscured or blurred, as if reality hesitated to reveal them fully. One night, in a dreamlike state, I found myself back in my apartment. But it wasn't mine. The walls were the same, but the furniture was different, older, worn. On the table lay a photograph of a woman I didn't recognize, smiling faintly. I reached out to touch it, and the world shifted again. I awoke in my bed, drenched in sweat. The photograph was on my kitchen counter. I stared at it for an agonizing moment before realizing I'd never seen it before. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't remember who she was. Days passed, or maybe weeks. Time blurred. The randomness of reality started to erode my sense of self. I couldn't tell if I was awake or trapped in some waking dream. The journal's warnings echoed in my head: accept the chaos, or be consumed by it. I refused to accept it. Instead, I tried to fight back. I marked every location I blinked into, leaving notes or signs. I was here, I wrote on peeling walls or scratched into wooden benches. Sometimes I left food, small tokens, hoping to anchor myself somehow. But the randomness didn't care. One afternoon, I blinked into a crowded subway car, packed with faces I didn't recognize. The lights flickered erratically, and the train screeched along tracks that seemed to twist and spiral impossibly. The passengers' eyes were glazed, vacant. A woman turned to me and whispered, "They never stop watching." The doors slid open at a station called Nowhere, and the entire car emptied except for me. The platform was a cavernous void, blackness stretching endlessly beyond. I stepped forward, heart pounding, and the train vanished behind me with a final screech. In that void, I realized something terrifying. The randomness wasn't just about place or time. It was about existence itself. My reality wasn't a constant stream but a fractured prism, splitting into countless shards of possibility. And somewhere, deep in the shadows, something was pulling the strings. I returned to my apartment that night, exhausted and hollow. The journal lay open on the table, its pages fluttering despite the still air. I shivered, a new understanding settling over me. I wasn't just a victim of random shifts. I was part of a puzzle I couldn't solve. And if I couldn't control the randomness, I would become lost within it forever. The next morning, the world felt less certain. I woke to the sharp echo of my own breath in the dark room and the faint, irregular hum of the heater kicking in. The air smelled stale, but not unpleasantly so, more like the scent of old books and damp wood, the kind of smell that settles in places you forget existed. I lay still for a long time, trying to remember where I was and why the corners of the room seemed to tilt ever so slightly, as if gravity had loosened its grip overnight. The ceiling fan above my bed was spinning backwards, or was it just my eyes playing tricks again? I forced myself up, putting my feet on the cold floor, and the room wavered through my vision like a poorly tuned television. I swayed until I found the dresser, gripping it. The mirror above caught my reflection, but it wasn't quite right. My eyes were the same, but the shape of my face seemed off. More angular. Stranger. Like looking at a sketch of myself rather than the real thing. I blinked hard, and the image settled. I was still me. But there was a prickling at the back of my neck, a silent warning that something had shifted beneath the surface of this reality, something I couldn't yet name. The day felt like stepping through broken glass. Each moment fragmented, overlapping, and slipping away before I could grasp it fully. I opened the door to the hallway and the house beyond, but the layout wasn't what I remembered. Where the living room should have been, there was an endless corridor lined with peeling wallpaper and flickering lights. The ceiling sagged low, and a stale draft whispered down the hall like it carried voices. I hesitated but forced myself to walk forward. Halfway down, I caught sight of a figure ahead. It was too dark to make out details, though the shape was vaguely familiar. As I stepped closer, the figure disappeared, melting into the shadows like a shadow itself. The fluorescent bulbs overhead buzzed loudly, then all went dark, plunging me into silence and black. I froze, heart hammering, until a faint glow appeared at the far end of the corridor, soft, pulsing, like a dying firefly. I rushed toward it, the floor uneven beneath my feet, and the glow revealed a cracked tile mosaic I hadn't seen before. It was a pattern of interlocking eyes, staring in every direction. The eyes blinked just once, and I stumbled back. The house wasn't a house anymore. It was something else. A labyrinth with no clear rules. I tried to retrace my steps, but the corridor twisted and stretched in impossible ways. Doors appeared and disappeared, some open, some locked, none leading where they should. I thought about calling someone, anyone, but my phone was dead. No signal. I felt cut off, as if I'd dropped into a sliver of a world that wasn't really there. It was like being caught between wakefulness and sleep, but deeper, more pervasive. Every sound was muffled, every surface warped. By mid-afternoon, or at least, what I thought was mid-afternoon, I found the kitchen. It was a room I knew well, but everything was wrong. The cupboards hung askew, the sink faucet dripped thick, black liquid, and on the counter lay a small cassette recorder. I hadn't seen one of those in years. Curiosity won over revulsion. I pressed play. A crackling voice filled the silence, wavering and hesitant. It was my own voice, but older, more worn. "Why am I here?" the tape said. "What is this place?" Every time I try to leave, it pulls me back. The walls breathe. The floor shifts. It's a trap. I swallowed past a sudden lump. That was me. Or a version of me, from some time or some reality where I'd already been caught in this strange in-between. The tape paused, then started again. "Don't trust the doors. They'll lead you somewhere worse. Follow the light only when you're sure it's real. Remember, this isn't a dream. This is the space between what's real and what's not. If you listen to the silence, it will speak." The tape ended abruptly. I slammed the recorder down, breathing hard, suddenly aware of how close I'd come to giving up, to letting the house swallow me whole. I searched for windows, any sign of the outside world, but found only thick walls that absorbed light. Then I heard the sound again, a faint, uneven tapping from somewhere above me. I climbed the creaky stairs, each step protesting, until I reached the attic door. It was unlocked, and when I pushed it open, the air inside was colder than the floors below. The faint tapping became clearer. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like a code. In the corner of the attic, a small wooden box sat on a dusty crate. I approached cautiously and opened it. Inside were dozens of Polaroid photos, each one capturing a different room in the house. But the photos didn't match the rooms as I remembered them. Some showed versions of the house with walls covered in shifting shadows, others with no furniture at all, just empty spaces. One photo showed me, standing in the hallway, eyes wide and unblinking. I flipped through the pictures quickly, heart pounding, until I found a note folded beneath them. Written in shaky handwriting was a single sentence. Reality is a choice you cannot make twice. I dropped the note in the photos, stepping back as the attic around me seemed to pulse and breathe. The ceiling warped, the floor tilted, and for a moment, I thought I saw the attic itself fold in on itself like a paper sheet being creased. I ran down the stairs, desperate to escape. But when I reached the main floor, I found the front door replaced by a blank wall. Panic surged through me. The house was a cage that rearranged itself to keep me inside. I sat down heavily on the floor, trying to steady my racing mind. The tape's warning echoed in my head, "Don't trust the doors." If the doors weren't to be trusted, then what could I trust? The walls? The floor? The air that seemed to thicken with each breath? The answer came in the quiet tapping from the attic, a slow, steady rhythm. I closed my eyes and listened closely. The tapping wasn't random. It was a pattern. A code. I had no idea what it meant, but it was a clue. A breadcrumb leading me through this shifting nightmare. I had to follow it. Even if it meant walking deeper into the unknown. Because the alternative was worse, endless wandering in this fractured space, slowly losing myself to the shifting shadows. I got to my feet, wiped the cold sweat from my brow, and headed back toward the stairs. Reality might be slipping through my fingers, but I wasn't done fighting for it yet. The tapping continued, guiding me upward, toward whatever was waiting in the darkness. Story 3, Truths of the Unseen Divide. The day started like any other, or at least as ordinary as my life ever got. I woke up in my cramped apartment, the sun filtering through cracks in the old blinds, a soft orange glow that somehow made the peeling wallpaper look less depressing. I had the usual morning routine: coffee, a quick scan of emails, a glance at the news. Nothing out of place. Nothing unusual. That's what I thought, anyway. I work from home, which means the lines between days blur into one another, but I keep track through my calendar. That morning, I had a video conference scheduled with a client at 10. The meeting went smoothly, discussions about app designs and deadlines, but then things started to slip. At around 11, I noticed my phone displaying a notification from a social media app one didn't remember installing. The icon was unfamiliar. I tapped it, and the screen flickered like a faulty television before showing me a message: "Welcome back." There was no sender, no app name, just that phrase. I swiped to close it, assuming it was some glitch, but the message stayed on the screen. I stared at it, a creeping unease settling in my chest. I turned the phone off and on again. The message vanished. I tried to shake it off and went to make lunch. The kitchen smelled of cold coffee and something faintly metallic that I couldn't identify. I chalked it up to a spill I hadn't noticed. When I opened the fridge, the light inside was a dull red, not the usual bright white. That was odd. I blinked and reopened the door. The red light persisted. I reached in and grabbed a carton of milk. The label was different, foreign characters I didn't recognize. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The label was in English with a familiar brand name. I closed the fridge quickly, feeling a shiver. Returning to my computer, I saw that the desktop wallpaper had changed. Instead of the skyline photo I'd set, it was a grainy black and white picture of a dense forest. I didn't remember downloading it. I tried to revert it, but the settings reset themselves before I could make changes. The clock in the corner of the screen blinked erratically, sometimes running backwards. I felt a wave of nausea and leaned back in my chair. I decided to get fresh air. The staircase in my building has always felt a little claustrophobic, but today, the walls seemed to pulse, like the paint was breathing. I caught a glimpse of myself in the smudged glass panel beside the door. I looked pale, my eyes too wide, like a frightened animal. I told myself it was stress, maybe too much caffeine or too little sleep. I was overthinking. I stepped outside, the familiar city street stretching before me, but something was off. The buildings were the same but rearranged, or so it seemed. The cafe across the street was now a dry cleaner's. Trees lined the sidewalks where none should be. I walked down the block, trying to orient myself. People passed by, some I recognized, others completely unfamiliar. Their faces were blurred, as if out of focus. When I tried to look closer, they turned and walked away, their forms glitching like pixels on a bad internet connection. I reached a small park I often visited. The benches were empty, and the air smelled faintly of burning plastic. I sat down, heart pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. The sky above switched rapidly between cloudy gray and a sharp blue, as though the weather couldn't decide what it wanted to be. I stared into the horizon and caught sight of a figure standing near the edge of the park, a man in a dark coat, his features obscured by shadow. When I blinked, he was gone. Fear crept in, cold and insistent. I pulled out my phone to call someone, anyone, but the screen was blank, unresponsive. I tried again, but the device remained dead. I turned to look around, hoping someone would help, but the park was deserted except for the shifting shadows and the faint hum of distant traffic that sounded wrong, like it was coming from underwater. I began walking back toward my building, but the street signs had changed. They were written in languages I couldn't read, and the numbers on the houses made no sense. I stopped to ask a passerby for directions, but when I opened my mouth, no sound came out. Panic surged through me. I tried again, whispering the words, but my voice was trapped behind a heavy silence. The stranger didn't react, they just looked through me, their eyes empty. I pressed my palms to my ears, willing myself to hear something, anything. The world was muted except for a low, rhythmic thudding that matched my heartbeat. Suddenly, the ground beneath me shifted. The pavement rippled like water, and the buildings twisted, elongating and compressing. I stumbled backward, clutching a lamppost for support as reality around me convulsed. A cold wind bit through my clothes, carrying with it indistinct voices whispering in tongues I almost recognized but couldn't place. I forced my eyes open and saw the figure from the park standing before me, closer now, his shape clearer but still not fully solid. His mouth moved, but the words were inaudible. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. Then, without warning, the world snapped back. The street was normal again, the sky steady, and the people around me resumed their hurried pace. My phone buzzed loudly in my pocket. I pulled it out to see a text message. "Did you see him too?" The message was from my best friend, Leah. I typed back quickly, "See who? What are you talking about?" No reply. The streetlights flickered as evening approached, and I realized I still hadn't eaten or rested. Still shaken, I made my way home, half expecting the apartment to be different as well. The door was where it should be, the lock turned smoothly. Inside, everything was as I'd left it, except for one thing. On the kitchen counter, a small, old-fashioned key lay beside my coffee mug. I didn't recognize it. I picked up the key, turning it over in my hand. It was cold and heavy, made of tarnished brass, with intricate engravings I couldn't decipher. There was no note, no explanation. Just the key, and the uneasy feeling that whatever had happened today was far from over. I sat down, staring at the key and the flickering shadows cast by the evening light. Somewhere deep inside me, I knew this wasn't a trick of my mind, nor a glitch in the system. It was something else, something beyond understanding. And it was only the beginning. I woke up with a start, the cold air pressing against my skin like a living thing. My room was the same as I'd left it the night before, or so I thought. For a moment, I was disoriented, the edges of my vision blurred and flickering, like a faulty television screen. Then I noticed the small details that didn't belong. The bookshelf was upside down, the books resting on the ceiling, their spines facing down as if gravity had reversed. I blinked. The ceiling was now a dull gray, not white as it should have been. I rubbed my eyes and sat up, the mattress protesting beneath me in an unfamiliar way. My heart pounded as I scanned the room. The window, the one that always faced the street, showed nothing but an endless, featureless gray void. No trees, no passing cars, no city lights. Just gray. I tried to stand, but my legs felt weak, unsteady. I reached out for the door, but instead of the usual wooden frame, my hand met a cold, metallic surface. I leaned into it and saw that the door was replaced by a mirror. I stared at myself, pale and disheveled, but then the reflection shifted. It wasn't quite me. The eyes were too dark, the smile too slow to fade. I slammed my hand against the mirror, and it rippled like water. The distorted reflection reached out its hand as if to touch mine from the other side. I yanked my hand back, breath catching. The room buzzed with a low vibration, almost inaudible but deeply unsettling. Desperate for normalcy, I closed my eyes and tried to remember how I'd gotten here. The last thing I recalled was leaving work late, the city empty and silent. I'd taken the shortcut through the alley, and then, nothing. The memory ended abruptly, like a missing page from a book. I opened my eyes again. The room had shifted once more. The walls were now lined with peeling wallpaper, stained yellow with age. The floorboards creaked as I stepped out of bed, groaning under my weight. Through the window, I saw a narrow street lit by flickering lampposts, but the street was deserted, and the buildings looked like they belonged in a different era. I walked to the door, which was now a cracked wooden portal, heavy and unwilling to open. I pushed, but it wouldn't budge. Panic rose in my throat. I started to bang on it, calling for help, but my voice felt hollow, swallowed by the thick air. A sound caught my attention, a faint tapping, rhythmic and steady. I turned toward the window. There was a figure standing outside on the street, barely visible through the grime-covered glass. The figure was indistinct, wrapped in shadows, but it seemed to be looking directly at me. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate. I stepped back from the window, heart racing. The figure vanished as if swallowed by the fog that now crept along the street. I was utterly alone. I felt the walls close in, the air thickening. I tried to steady my breathing, to think. Something was happening, something impossible. The reality I knew was bending, reshaping itself around me. I reached into my pocket for my phone, desperate for a tether to the world I understood. It was gone. I checked every surface, nightstand, dresser, floor. Nothing. Even my clothes seemed different, rougher, heavier, as if I had changed outfits without noticing. The weight of unfamiliarity pressed down on me, making my skin crawl. I moved back to the window and tried to peer outside again. The street was still empty, save for the creeping fog. Then, a sound from behind, a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakably human. I spun around. The room was empty. No one there. The whisper grew louder, words, fragmented and unintelligible, but urgent. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to shut it out. The voice warped and shifted, sometimes female, sometimes male, always just beyond clarity. A sudden slam echoed from upstairs, a door or window breaking. My heart leapt into my throat. I hadn't noticed a staircase before. I hadn't noticed much before. The house was changing with every breath I took. I found the stairs, narrow and creaking, leading up into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming to run, but I needed answers. I climbed, each step groaning beneath me. At the top, the hallway stretched out impossibly long, the walls lined with doors that looked familiar and foreign all at once. Some doors were cracked open, revealing rooms that flickered between scenes: a child's bedroom one moment, a sterile hospital room the next. I approached the nearest door, the one that should have been my old bedroom. Inside, I saw myself lying on the bed, eyes closed. But as I watched, that version of me opened his eyes and smiled, a cold, knowing smile that did not belong to me. I stumbled back, heart pounding. The door slammed shut behind me as if pushed by an unseen force, plunging me into silence. I leaned against the wall, trying to catch my breath. I was trapped in some distorted echo of my life, a shifting labyrinth of memories and nightmares. The line between what was real and what was not had blurred completely. Then the whisper returned, louder and clearer, "You don't belong here." I spun around, searching the shadows. The voice was everywhere and nowhere. The floor beneath me vibrated, the walls pulsated, and the air thickened until I felt like I was sinking into it. I had no idea how long I stood there, paralyzed by the increasing chaos. When I finally moved, it was toward the last door at the end of the hallway, the one that hadn't changed at all. It was my apartment's front door. My fingers trembled as I turned the knob. The door opened onto a familiar street bathed in afternoon sunlight. I stepped outside, taking a deep breath, relishing the warmth. But something was wrong. The street was empty, eerily silent, no cars, no people. The sky above was a dull, featureless gray, as if the world had been drained of color. I turned and looked back at the building. It had vanished, replaced by nothing but a barren lot. Panic surged again. I realized then that the world around me was a patchwork of realities, each fragment bleeding into the next without warning or logic. There was no safe place, no fixed point. I had to find a way back to myself, or what was left of me, before this random reality swallowed me whole. The tapping started again, steady and unrelenting, coming from the empty lot behind me. I turned toward the sound, knowing that whatever was making it was waiting, watching. And I had no choice but to follow. I woke up to the dull ache of yesterday's confusion still lodged behind my eyes, the way a bad dream lingers when you only half leave it behind. The room was too quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get in a house where everyone has just gone to bed, but the kind where time seems to have paused, holding its breath. I glanced at my phone, 7:13 a.m. on a Tuesday, but the screen flickered strangely, distorted, as if the numbers themselves were trying to move away from me. I didn't remember going to sleep. Last night had been a blur. The episode where the world fractured and slipped beneath me, like stepping onto cracked glass that suddenly became a pit instead of a floor, was still fresh. I had seen the kitchen walls ripple, folding inward like fabric, and the hallway stretch impossibly long, doors appearing and disappearing like mirages. It wasn't a hallucination, not really. It was as if reality itself was unspooling, tearing at the seams. I told myself I was just overtired, maybe losing grip on sanity, but the more I tried to pin down what was wrong, the less sense it made. The way the coffee pot had vanished in front of me, only to appear seconds later in the freezer, was not something you just forget. At least, I didn't think so. I sat up slowly, trying to orient myself to the familiar surroundings of my bedroom. The ceiling fan spun lazily, casting long, flickering shadows across the walls. I noticed something odd. The shadows didn't align with the fan's blades. They moved independently, twitching like nervous insects. My heart sped up, but I forced myself to breathe deeply. Getting out of bed, I moved toward the door. I paused, hand on the knob, and the hallway ahead seemed to stretch and pulse before my eyes, like a living thing breathing slow and deep. I blinked, and it snapped back to normal. "Get it together," I muttered. But the floor beneath my feet felt soft, almost sponge-like, sinking slightly with each step. The carpet didn't feel right either. When I ran my fingers over it, it was wet, clammy, like moss in a damp forest. I pulled back, confused. I knew this carpet was plush, dry, synthetic. The front door opened with a creak that sounded like it was coming from far away, though I was alone in the house. I stepped outside, expecting the usual chill of the early morning in late October. Instead, the air was thick and humid, heavy with the smell of rain and something else, something metallic and bitter that hinted at rust and old blood. I glanced down the street. The houses were all there, the familiar shapes dimmed by the gray light of dawn, but the colors were off. The trees were a sickly yellow-green instead of the fiery reds and oranges they were last week. The sky looked wrong too, a flat, featureless gray that swallowed the horizon. For a moment, I thought I had stepped into an alternate version of my neighborhood, one where something had gone horribly wrong. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking, my feet hesitant but propelled by a need to find something solid, something real. As I rounded the corner, the world shifted again. The street became a long tunnel, walls closing in with graffiti that wasn't there moments before. The sky disappeared altogether, the sun was swallowed by a suffocating darkness, yet I felt light falling on my face as if from a hidden source. I stopped, listening. There was no wind. No birds. No cars. A silence so complete it pressed against my ears like water. I tried to call my phone again, but it buzzed and died in my hand. Dead battery, I thought, but the screen was black even when I plugged it in at home. The charger was missing too. The unease started to build into panic. I jogged back the way I came, but the path twisted unexpectedly, leading me into a narrow alley framed by crumbling brick buildings that I didn't remember being there. The alley was lined with discarded objects, broken chairs, torn papers, rusty cans, but all seemed disturbingly fresh, like they had been thrown out moments ago. As I moved deeper, the shadows thickened, pulling at the edges of my vision. I thought I heard footsteps behind me, quick and light, but when I spun around, no one was there. The alley ended abruptly in a dead end, a wall of graffiti scrawled with words I couldn't read but that seemed to pulse in my mind's eye. The wall vibrated, and the letters shifted, rearranging themselves, then stopping to form a sentence I could understand. You are not here. A chill ran down my spine. I turned back, but the alley had changed. The exit was gone. Instead, a dark corridor stretched ahead, swallowing the weak light from the street. I wanted to run, but my legs felt leaden, trapped under a weight I couldn't see. I took a step forward. The corridor warped, the walls bending inward, and I stumbled as the ground beneath me tilted like a ship caught in a storm. I caught myself on a cracked pipe, breathing hard. The air smelled like burnt rubber and wet earth. Then it happened again, the world fractured. A sharp crack like breaking glass echoed in my ears, and suddenly I was somewhere else entirely. I was standing in my living room, but everything was upside down. The ceiling was the floor, the furniture seemed to grow from the ceiling like stalactites, and the television flickered with static that formed fleeting images of faces twisting and screaming. I reached out to touch the couch, but my hand passed through it like smoke. A cold dread settled in my chest. This wasn't real. None of this was real. Or maybe it was, but not in any way that made sense. Trying to steady myself, I closed my eyes. When I opened them again, I was back in my bedroom, lying on the bed as if I had never left it. The clock on the wall ticked normally, the shadows behaved, and the air smelled like fresh linen. But my head throbbed with the weight of what I had just experienced, a sensation like waking from a nightmare only to find the nightmare has followed you home. I sat up, heart pounding, and picked up my phone. It lit up, displaying a message I hadn't sent or received. Reality is a choice you don't get to make. The line went blank, the screen flickering one last time before dying again. I sat there, the silence pressing in, and tried to make sense of it. I had no answers. Only the terrifying certainty that the world around me was fractured, splintered into versions I couldn't control or predict. I was trapped inside something that rewrote itself at random, where the rules changed without warning. And the worst part was knowing that no matter how hard I tried, I had no idea how to fix it or survive it. When I woke that morning, the room looked the same, or at least as similar as it ever had. The dull gray light filtered through the cracked blinds, casting uneven stripes across the peeling wallpaper. But I didn't feel like myself. The edges of everything seemed off. Not just my reflection in the cracked mirror by the sink, which had always been a little distorted, but the very way the air moved through the room, as if reality was vibrating just a fraction out of sync with my senses. I sat on the edge of the bed for what felt like minutes, trying to ground myself. The last thing I remembered was that bizarre episode at the diner, when the waitress had looked at me with such strange recognition, as if I'd been there before, though I never had. I rubbed my eyes and tried to will the feeling away. That uneasy sensation of being unmoored from the world was nothing new, but it was definitely getting worse. I stood and shuffled to the window, pulling the blinds aside just enough to peek out. The street was quiet, the same cracked sidewalks and aging cars parked along the curb. But the house directly across the street, the one with the black wrought iron fence and the faded white paint, it was gone. Instead, an empty lot stretched out, bare dirt and scattered weeds where the house had been. I blinked hard. That had to be a trick of the light, or maybe I was still dreaming. I rubbed my temples and stepped back from the window, only to find the room subtly different as well. The painting I hung last week was missing, replaced with a photograph of a place I didn't recognize, a dark forest with twisted trees, their branches clawing at a sky thick with fog. I swallowed hard. Nothing made sense anymore. The walls seemed to breathe, expanding and contracting in a rhythm just beneath perception. I reached for my phone but hesitated. The screen lit up, but the time was nonsensical, jumping between midnight and dawn in rapid succession. The battery percentage flickered like a faulty light bulb, surging from 73 to 2 to 98 to 45% in seconds. Flickering through the notifications, I saw messages I didn't recall receiving, some from friends who apparently thought I was somewhere I wasn't, others from strangers with cryptic warnings. One simply read, "Don't trust the sky today." I pocketed the phone and forced myself to leave the apartment. I needed fresh air, or at least a change in scenery to reset my fractured mind. The hallway outside was silent, the usual thrum of neighbors absent. As I stepped into the elevator, the digital floor indicator blinked erratically. The doors closed, then reopened immediately. I stepped out again, only to find I was standing in a different building, one with dimly lit corridors covered in unfamiliar graffiti and the faint scent of mildew. Panic prickled at the back of my neck. I tried to turn back, but the elevator was gone, replaced by a set of stairs leading down into darkness. I hesitated, then descended. The musty smell grew stronger as I moved deeper, and distant echoes of dripping water bounced off the walls. At the bottom, I pushed open a heavy metal door and stepped into what looked like a subway station, but it was abandoned and crumbling. The platform was empty except for an old newspaper laying on the ground. I bent to pick it up and froze. The date was decades old, February 12, 1983. The headline read, "Strange Disappearances Plague City Subway." I felt a cold sweat bead down my spine. I shoved the paper into my jacket pocket and started toward the stairs. As I climbed, the lights flickered and a low hum grew, like the subway was awakening after a long sleep. I reached the surface and burst out into a street that shouldn't have existed. The architecture was wrong, old-fashioned storefronts with faded signs, cobblestone streets slick with rain, and people dressed in styles from another era. I realized I wasn't just somewhere else, I was somewhere else in time. I tried to speak to a passerby, but their eyes glazed over, unfocused. I reached out again, and their face twisted into a mask of fear before they vanished into thin air, leaving a faint scent of smoke behind. The sky above was a dull gray, but the clouds moved like living creatures, pulsing and shifting unnaturally. I turned toward what I thought was the nearest building, desperate to find shelter or at least some clue about where I was. The door creaked open before I could touch it, revealing a dimly lit room filled with strange machines humming softly. A man sat at a desk, his face obscured by shadows. He looked up and smiled a slow, knowing smile. "Lost, are we?" he said quietly. I swallowed and nodded. "Where am I?" I asked. He chuckled. "That's the question, isn't it? You've crossed into a place between places. A patchwork of realities stitched together by chance and chaos." I frowned. "I don't understand." He gestured to the machines. "Think of reality as a river, usually steady and predictable. But here, the currents split and merge randomly, carrying you to shores you never expected. Sometimes, you find fragments of the past. Other times, you glimpse futures that never came to pass." I shivered. "How do I get back?" He shrugged. "That depends. Are you willing to accept that the world you knew is just one of many versions? That your memories might not be reliable? That the ground beneath your feet could shift without warning?" I bit my lip, the weight of his words settling in. "I just want to be home." He stood and walked toward a panel of buttons and levers. "Then we'll have to find the right current to ride. But be warned, reality doesn't like to be pinned down. It will fight you. Twist itself until you lose track of what's real and what's not." The machines whirred louder, the air crackling with static energy. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath as the room blurred around me. When I opened them again, I was back in my apartment, the familiar gray light filtering through the blinds. The painting was gone, replaced once more by that eerie forest photograph. I checked my phone, normal time, normal battery. But outside my window, the owls across the street had returned. I sank onto the bed, exhausted and confused. I didn't know what had happened or how to control it, but one thing was clear: reality was no longer fixed. It was a shifting maze, and I was trapped inside. And somewhere, deep beneath the surface of this fractured world, something was watching. I woke to a silence that felt carved out of stone. No distant hum of city traffic, no birdsong, not even the faintest creak or groan of the old house settling. At first, I thought I'd overslept, but the clock on the bedside table was missing, vanished like everything else, every trace of the night swallowed whole. My breath hitched as I sat up, the thin sheet tangled around my legs like a net. The room looked wrong. The walls, which had been a muted gray the evening before, were now a dull beige, uneven in tone. The peeling paint patches I'd memorized over years of insomnia had shifted positions. I reached out, tracing the line where the wall met the ceiling, hoping to anchor myself. But the texture beneath my fingers was different, smoother, colder. I got out of bed and stepped toward the door, but it wasn't the door I remembered. This one was narrower, and the brass doorknob was replaced by a cold, black mat handle that didn't turn. I yanked it anyway. Nothing. Panic started knotting in my stomach. I looked around. There was no wardrobe, no dresser, no desk. The only furniture was a rickety wooden chair in the corner, its backrest askew, and a small, round table holding a single glass half full of water. I blinked, trying to remember how it had looked hours ago. The chair had been missing then. The water glass wasn't there either. I swallowed hard and tried to steady myself. This wasn't a dream. I'd been awake, fully conscious when I went to sleep. Or so I thought. The idea that I might be dreaming now was even worse. My phone was on the nightstand, or at least I thought it should be. I turned the table upside down, no luck. The signal bars on the screen were gone, replaced by a solid blackness that pulsed faintly, like a dying heartbeat. When I pressed the power button, it glimmered once and shut off. I tried again. Dead. Suddenly, the room seemed to tilt, a subtle, nauseating shift that made my vision swim. I gripped the chair to steady myself. I was alone, locked in a room that refused to be remembered accurately, a cage of shifting realities I couldn't predict or control. I sat down heavily, heart pounding, trying to calm the dizziness. Something was happening to the fabric of my world. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, a gnawing unease that clawed at the edges of my mind. I tried to recall the last few days, searching for anything out of place, anything that might explain this. The only memory that stood out was the strange man I'd seen in the park that day with the gray sky and the street lamp that flickered like a dying star. He had said something about truth and lies blending until you couldn't tell them apart. At the time, I dismissed him as a lunatic. Now, I wondered whether he was a warning. The walls seemed to breathe around me, shifting again. I stood and pressed my hands against the plaster, trying to focus. I could almost hear a faint humming, a low, drone-like vibration that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I remembered a phrase from one of those conspiracy forums I'd stumbled on months ago, random reality. The idea that reality itself might not be a fixed construct but a shifting, unpredictable canvas, vulnerable to glitches, distortions, and fractures. It had sounded absurd then, but now, trapped in this morphing room, I could no longer deny its possibility. The chair creaked behind me. I spun around, heart in my throat. The room was empty, but the air was thick with a presence I couldn't see, a weight pressing down on me like a suffocating fog. I took a deep breath and tried to move toward the door again. This time, it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped into a hallway I didn't recognize. The walls were lined with mirrors, their surfaces rippling like water disturbed by a stone. I caught a glimpse of myself in one, pale, disheveled, eyes wide with fear. As I walked, the reflection shifted. In one, I saw myself smiling calmly, a stranger in my own skin. In another, I saw myself with bloodied hands, staring back with wild, unblinking eyes. I stopped, overwhelmed. Was I losing my mind, or was the very world unraveling around me? Suddenly, a whisper brushed past me, barely audible. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was desperate, pleading. I followed the sound, the always stretching and contracting like the inhale and exhale of some massive, unseen creature. At the end, a door appeared, black, smooth, without a handle. I pressed my palm against it, and the whisper grew louder, transforming into a voice I recognized, my own, but warped, distant and echoing. "Find the center," it said. "Find the core. It's the only way." I swallowed hard and hesitated. Could there really be a center to all this madness? A place where these shifts began or ended? I pushed the door open and stepped into a cavernous space lit by an eerie, pulsating light. The walls here were made of translucent panels, revealing a swirling mass of colors and shapes that defied description. In the center of the room sat a device. It looked like a cross between an old radio and a modern computer, its surface covered in dials and flickering screens. A single red button blinked steadily. I moved closer, drawn as if by a magnet, and noticed a small note taped to the side, pressed to reset. "Beware the cost." My hand trembled. Pressing that button could restore normality or obliterate everything. I thought of my life, my memories, the people I loved. Could I risk losing them to escape this nightmare? The whispers returned, urgent now, almost frantic. "Press it," they said, "or be lost forever." I closed my eyes, heart hammering in my chest. When I opened them again, I pressed the button. The world fractured like glass underfoot. Colors exploded, sound shattered, and I was swallowed by light. When I came to, I was back in my bedroom. The walls were their familiar gray, the peeling paint in the same spots as always. My phone sat on the nightstand, glowing softly with a missed call from my sister. I reached for it, shaking, and answered. "Are you okay?" her voice asked, trembling. I swallowed and nodded, though she couldn't see me. "I'm here," I said. "I'm here." But deep down, I knew the truth was more complicated. The reality I'd escaped was still lurking, waiting to slip back through the cracks. And I wasn't sure if the reset had fixed anything or just delayed the rot beneath. Story 4, Mirrors of the Lost Horizon. When I think back to that night, my mind struggles to piece together what really happened. The memories come in fragments, like a broken mirror reflecting strange, distorted images. It's hard to know what was real and what wasn't, but I'm certain of one thing: something about the world shifted around me, and not in any way that made sense. I had been out late, working on a story for the local paper, the kind of piece that demanded digging through old records and interviewing people long forgotten by the town. The subject was a series of disappearances that had happened over decades, all unsolved, all quietly swept under the rug. I'd spent weeks chasing down leads, but the more I uncovered, the weirder it got. People I talked to would sometimes forget the conversations, or insist on details I was sure I never mentioned. At first, I blamed the stress and exhaustion, but now I wonder if that was the beginning of something else. The night it all became undeniable was cold and clear. I was driving home around 11:30 when I noticed the dashboard clock flicker once, then twice, before settling on a time that was exactly 30 minutes ahead of reality. I thought it was a glitch, and I pulled over to reset it, but every time I changed the time, it jumped to a new random number. It wasn't just the clock. The radio would catch snippets of conversations I couldn't understand, as if it were tuning into different frequencies. Static, then a woman's voice speaking rapid, strange words, then silence. I switched it off. That's when the first real change happened. The road I was on didn't look like the one I had been driving for the last hour. Instead of the familiar stretch lined with tall pines, I found myself on a narrow dirt path flanked by overgrown bushes and trees that reached too close to the car's windows, their dark branches tapping against the glass like bony fingers. The headlights barely illuminated the way ahead. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the scene didn't change. I tried to turn around, but the steering wheel felt heavier than usual, as if resisting. I gripped it tighter and finally managed to reverse, the tires crunching over dry leaves and twigs. When I pulled back onto the paved road, everything looked different. The road signs were unfamiliar, the houses that lined the street were older, some even seemed abandoned, with broken windows and peeling paint. I checked my phone. No signal. That was strange, but I told myself it was probably just a dead zone. Still, when I opened the map app, the GPS showed my location at a place that didn't exist in this town. The name was a jumble of letters, like a corrupted file. I took a deep breath and tried to think logically. Maybe I had passed a new development I didn't know about. I aimed for the highway, hoping to find a familiar landmark. But as I drove, the scenery kept changing, almost like it was shuffling between different realities. One moment, I'd pass a gas station that looked brand new. The next, it would look like a crumbling relic from decades ago. A billboard advertising a movie that had never been released. A streetlight flickering in a pattern that felt like Morse code. I tried calling my editor, but the call wouldn't connect. The streetlights suddenly went out, plunging the road into darkness. My headlights started to dim and then died altogether. I reached for the glove compartment to grab a flashlight, but the door wouldn't budge. My hands trembled as I realized the car might not be functioning properly anymore. That's when I heard footsteps behind the car. Slow, deliberate, but faint. I turned quickly, expecting to see someone standing there, but there was only darkness. I shook my head and told myself it was my imagination, the stress catching up with me. I locked the doors and tried to calm down, breathing shallow breaths. Then the car radio crackled to life again, louder this time. The voice was clearer now, a man's voice speaking in a calm, measured tone. "You're not supposed to be here," it said. "This isn't your world." My heart pounded in my chest. I fumbled for the door handle, but it was stuck. The voice continued, "You don't belong here. You don't belong anywhere anymore." I slammed my hands against the steering wheel, desperate to get out. The footsteps came closer, crunching on the dry leaves. I could see a shadow now, barely visible just beyond the reach of the headlights. It didn't look human, but it wasn't something I could place. The shape shifted, sometimes taller, sometimes shorter, like a glitch in a video game. Suddenly, the car jerked forward on its own, plowing through the bushes and back onto the main road. The radio cut out. The headlights flickered back on. I slammed on the brakes and pulled over, gasping for air. The shadow was gone. The world around me had snapped back to the quiet, familiar stretch of road I recognized. I sat there for a long time, staring into the dark woods. I wanted to believe it was a hallucination, a trick of the mind. But everything felt wrong, like reality was tearing at the edges. The air was heavier. The silence was deafening. When I finally started the car again, I noticed the dashboard clock was back to the correct time. My phone buzzed with a single message, "Don't trust your eyes." I didn't sleep that night. I drove straight home, keeping the doors locked and the windows up. The next morning, everything seemed normal, too normal. The people on the street didn't notice me, like I was invisible. The news was silent about the disappearances I'd been investigating. My editor acted like my calls never happened. Only one thing remained certain: something had shifted in the world around me, and I wasn't sure if I could ever find my way back to the reality I knew. The morning light filtered weakly through the thin curtains, casting a pale, washed-out glow across the room. I stayed still for a moment, unable to move, my mind stubbornly clinging to the remnants of the disorienting nightmare that had woken me. The edges of reality felt softer here, as if the world was slightly out of focus, like a photograph printed on cheap paper. The memory of last night's events, the flickering lights, the voices that weren't there, the sudden, impossible changes in the apartment replayed with a clarity that was both vivid and wrong. I forced myself out of bed, the floor cold beneath my feet. The apartment looked the same as I'd left it the night before, but I knew better. The details were shifting, reshaping themselves in ways I couldn't explain. My coffee mug had suddenly changed color, then shape, as if it were a mirage created by some cruel trick of perception. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes, but the inconsistency remained, subtle and maddening. I shuffled to the kitchen and set the coffee pot on the stove, hoping the routine might ground me. The ticking of the old clock on the wall was oddly off, too fast or slow depending on how I listened. Time itself seemed to be losing cohesion, snapping and stretching like a broken rubber band. I glanced at my phone, expecting a timestamp that would make sense, but the screen was blank. No signal, no messages, no calls. The city outside the window hummed with life, but as I stared, the scene blurred and warped until the buildings looked like badly rendered models in a video game. I took a deep breath and tried to focus. This wasn't a hallucination, it wasn't sleep deprivation or drugs. I hadn't touched anything unusual. Something else was happening. Something I couldn't control. The previous night's encounter with the shadowy figure still haunted me. It hadn't been a dream. I could swear I had seen it standing at the edge of my hallway, just out of reach, watching silently. The shape shifted, flickered, sometimes almost blended into the walls, like it was part of the building itself. It was impossible to pin down, impossible to describe fully. I told myself to shake it off, to call a friend, to do anything that might snap me out of this creeping sense of unreality. But the phone remained unresponsive, and the apartment's walls seemed to breathe faintly with a life of their own. I opened my laptop, hoping for normalcy, but the screen blinked erratically before settling on a single word typed repeatedly in a blank document: change. The font shuffled through different styles and sizes, the letters warping and stretching as if the word itself was alive and mocking me. I closed the lid quickly, heart racing. Then it happened again. The room shifted under my gaze. A picture frame on the wall rotated slowly, the image inside warping from a landscape into something dark and indistinct, something that looked like I was watching me. I reached out to steady it, but my hand passed through as if the frame was a hologram, an illusion. Panic tightened in my chest. I backed away slowly, eyes darting to every corner, expecting something to emerge or dissolve. The air grew colder, and the shadows deepened, stretching unnaturally. I remembered the old notebook I'd found in the building's basement last week, the one covered in cryptic notes and diagrams about reality glitches and dimensional overlaps. At the time, I'd laughed it off as the ramblings of a paranoid tenant. Now, the words seemed prophetic. I grabbed my coat and headed out, desperate to escape the suffocating instability of the apartment. The hallways were endless, twisting, and corridors looped back on themselves in impossible ways. The exit signs flickered and changed positions whenever I looked away. I ran, heart pounding, willing myself to find the stairs, but every door I tried led to rooms I didn't recognize, kitchens with rotten food, empty bedrooms, or long, featureless halls that vanished into darkness. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate. I dared not turn around. The sound followed, mirroring my pace perfectly, sometimes stopping when I stopped, then starting again when I moved. I felt watched, hunted, and utterly trapped. Finally, I found a door marked exit. I threw it open and stumbled into the daylight, the bustling street outside welcoming and unfamiliar. The city seemed different, altered. The people moved like mannequins, their faces blank, their eyes empty. They didn't acknowledge me. I walked for hours, trying to find something familiar, my apartment, my building, any landmark to hold on to. But the city was a shifting maze. Streets changed names, buildings appeared and disappeared, and faces morphed before my eyes. The sunlight above flickered like a broken bulb, casting erratic shadows. I stopped at a cafe, desperate for a lifeline. The barista looked at me with a blank stare, then smiled a slow, mechanical smile that chilled me to the bone. When I ordered a coffee, the words came out garbled, distorted, as if my own voice was betraying me. I looked down at my hands and saw them flicker, becoming transparent and then solid again. My reflection in the window was fractured, splitting into multiple versions of myself, each moving asynchronously. The realization hit me like a cold wave. Reality itself was fracturing around me, random and unreliable. There was no pattern, no logic, only chaos and uncertainty. I remembered the notebook again. It spoke of anchoring points, objects or people that could stabilize the fractured layers of reality. I had to find something real, something constant. But what could that be, when even my memories felt suspect? I pocketed the notebook and wandered back toward the building, hoping it would offer some refuge, some consistency. But when I arrived, the entrance had vanished, replaced by an empty lot overgrown with weeds. The world was unraveling, piece by piece, and I was caught in the middle of a nightmare with no end. I woke up with a sharp taste of copper in my mouth, the kind that lingers after biting your tongue hard enough to bleed. The room was unfamiliar, yet it held a strange familiarity, as if I'd been there before but couldn't quite place when or why. The walls were a featureless beige, unadorned except for a single window covered by cheap white blinds. The air was stale and heavy, pressing down on my lungs. I blinked against the dim light filtering through the blinds and sat up slowly, trying to remember how I got here. My head throbbed, a dull pulse behind my eyes, and a vague sense of unease settled deep in my stomach. The bed beneath me was narrow and uncomfortable, the sheets rough against my skin. I looked around, confusion twisting into alarm. Nothing about this place made sense. The door was closed, and I wasn't sure if it was locked. I stood up and walked toward it, my bare feet cold against the linoleum floor. I tried the handle, it turned easily. The hallway outside was dimly lit, longer than it should have been, stretching into shadows that seemed to move just out of the corner of my vision. I stepped out and peered left and right. At the end of the corridor, a faint, flickering light pulsed irregularly, like a dying bulb struggling to survive. The air smelled faintly of mildew and something else I couldn't identify, something metallic and bitter. I hesitated, then started down the hall toward the light. As I walked, I noticed details that didn't add up. The floor tiles were cracked and uneven, but the walls looked freshly painted, too clean for a place so clearly neglected. I passed a cracked mirror hanging crookedly on the wall, and for a moment, I caught my reflection. It wasn't quite right. My eyes were the same, but my expression was blank, almost vacant, like a mask. I blinked, and the image wavered, as if the glass were rippling like water. I shook it off and kept moving, drawn toward the light. It led me to a room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar, revealing a small space cluttered with boxes and old furniture covered in dusty sheets. The flickering came from a single fluorescent tube overhead, buzzing faintly. I stepped inside, and the door slammed shut behind me with a sudden thud. My heart jumped into my throat. I rushed over and yanked the handle, but it was locked tight. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice sounded hollow, swallowed by the thick walls. Panic prickled along my skin like ice water. I turned back to the room, searching for a window or another exit, but there was only the bare concrete walls and the shadows they cast. I collapsed onto one of the dusty chairs, trying to calm my breathing. The room was silent except for the buzz of the light above. I stared at the boxes stacked in the corner, noticing words scribbled on the sides in messy handwriting. Archives, evidence, lost. The labels made me shiver. Lost what? Evidence of what? I rummaged through one of the boxes, pulling out papers yellowed with age. They looked like records, case files, reports, photographs. One photo caught my eye, a building, the facade peeling and cracked, with a sign barely legible that read St. Mary's. I recognized it instantly. It was the old hospital on the edge of town, the place where I'd worked years ago before everything fell apart. A sudden jolt of memory hit me. I remembered the accident, the car crash, the fire, the way I'd lost track of time in the weeks afterward. But this room, this place, didn't fit any timeline I knew. It was like my memories were fragments from different realities, stitched together haphazardly. I dropped the photo and backed away, heart pounding. I had to get out. I tapped the door again, louder this time, willing someone, anyone, to hear me. A faint scrape came from the corridor, followed by a soft, almost inaudible whisper. I pressed my ear to the door. "Help me," the voice breathed, barely a breath. I staggered back, terrified. The voice was mine. Or at least, it sounded like mine. The room seemed to tilt, the walls pulsing like a heartbeat. For a moment, the shadows gathered in the corners, thickening into shapes that twisted and writhed. My skin crawled as a cold dread seeped into my bones. I closed my eyes, willing the darkness away. When I opened them, the room had changed again. The boxes were gone, replaced by a bare hospital bed with crisp white sheets. A figure lay on it, motionless, covered by a blanket. A faint glow emanated from the figure, a soft light that made the shadows retreat. I moved closer, heart hammering in my chest. The blanket shifted, and the figure sat up suddenly, gasping, eyes wide with shock. It was me. Or a version of me. The same haunted expression, the same hollow gaze. "Where am I?" the figure whispered. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. The reality around us felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. The figure looked at me, confusion and fear blending in those empty eyes. Then, just as suddenly, the light dimmed, and the figure dissolved into mist. The room warped again, walls melting into a blur of shapes and colors. I stumbled, trying to find footing in the shifting landscape. The whispers came back, overlapping in a chorus of voices, fragments of conversations, cries for help, warnings I couldn't decipher. Then, through the chaos, one phrase echoed clearly, "Find the truth." I didn't know what truth. I didn't know why or how. But I knew I had to keep moving, keep searching, even if reality itself was unraveling beneath my feet. The door clicked open behind me. I turned to see a man standing there, his face obscured by shadows. His voice was calm, almost gentle. "You're closer than you think." I took a step forward, eyes fixed on the figure. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead, flickering lights revealing glimpses of places I recognized: my apartment, the crash site, the hospital, each scene twisting and folding into the next. I swallowed hard, gripping the edges of my sanity. Whatever this was, whatever was happening to me, it wasn't random anymore. It was a puzzle, a maze I had to navigate. And I was the only one who could. As I stepped into the corridor, the figure vanished, and the door shut behind me, leaving only the hum of the flickering lights and the faint, persistent whisper of the truth waiting to be uncovered. The morning light was a pale thing, diffused through the grime on my window, and it felt heavier than usual, as if it pressed down against my skin. I woke with a start, sweat clinging to my temples, the strange, hollow feeling from the night before still clinging to my bones. I glanced at the clock, 6:17 a.m., and for a moment, I was completely disoriented. The room was the same, the furniture exactly where I had left it, but something was wrong. Something subtle, like a whispered note out of tune. I rubbed my eyes and sat up slowly, the wooden floor cold beneath my bare feet. The air smelled faintly of dust and something metallic. I felt the weight of the strange sensation again, the nagging sense that reality was not quite stable, that the world around me was unspooling thread by thread. My phone lay on the desk, screen dark and lifeless. I picked it up, pressing the power button. Nothing. No response. That was odd. It hadn't been dead when I went to bed. Normally, it would have charged through the night. I went over to the window and pulled aside the curtain, expecting the usual view of the street below. Instead, the buildings looked off. The windows didn't match. One apartment had a glowing orange light spilling out, but it was the middle of the morning. The street was unnaturally quiet, too quiet, with no hint of movement. I squinted, trying to make out details, but the scene felt like a low-resolution video buffering slowly. I backed away, trying to ground myself. Maybe I was still dreaming, or maybe this was some kind of leftover nightmare. I told myself it was nothing, that I'd just been overtired and the shadows had played tricks on me. But beneath the surface of that rational thought, doubt was creeping in. I wandered into the kitchen, expecting the usual clutter, but it was disturbingly neat. The coffee maker was spotless, no sign of last night's brew. The fridge hummed softly, but when I opened it, the contents were strange: jars with labels I didn't recognize, a carton of eggs that looked pristine and unnaturally white, and a loaf of bread that seemed to have no texture, like it had been rendered from some digital template. I closed the door quickly, a cold shiver running down my spine. There was a soft beep from the living room. I followed the sound and found my laptop on the coffee table. It was open, displaying a blank document. The cursor blinked steadily, but there was no text. I leaned closer, fingers trembling, and then suddenly, words appeared on the screen, typed out one by one, as if by an invisible hand. "Do you see it?" the message read. I swallowed hard. My breath felt stuck in my throat. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Was this some kind of joke? A prank? I typed back, my fingers hesitant. Who is this? No reply. The message disappeared, replaced by a new line. They are watching. You are slipping. A cold sweat broke out across my back. I slammed the laptop shut and sat back on the couch, trying to calm my racing heart. This had to be a glitch, some strange message left by a hacker, or an elaborate prank. It had to be. But the feeling in the room thickened, and the light seemed to dim imperceptibly, like the world was fading at the edges. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, the door clicking shut behind me with a hollow finality. The street was empty, but the buildings looked even more distorted now. Windows were warped, their frames bending like melting wax. The pavement beneath my feet rippled like a disturbed pond. I blinked rapidly, but nothing corrected itself. A cold wind picked up, carrying with it a faint murmur, almost like whispered voices just beyond the edge of hearing. I turned toward the nearest cafe, hoping to find someone, anyone, who could confirm that this reality was still the one I knew. Inside, the cafe was deserted except for a barista who stood behind the counter, motionless. I called out, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on something behind me, wide and unblinking. I turned quickly, but there was nothing there. When I looked back, she was gone. Panic uncoiled inside me like a serpent. I ran out into the street. The sky above was shifting, colors bleeding into each other like wet paint. I tried to call my sister, but the signal was gone. My phone still wouldn't turn on. The more I moved through the city, the more the world seemed to unravel. Street signs changed as I passed them, names I didn't recognize, directions that made no sense. Storefronts morphed between styles and eras. A modern hipster shop became a dusty antique store, then a boarded-up ruin. I caught glimpses of people, their faces blurred or flickering, as if their images were corrupted files. I stopped in front of a cracked mirror in a broken shop window. My reflection wavered, my face distorted. For a moment, I thought I saw something else behind me, a shadowy figure slipping away. I spun around, heart hammering, but the street was empty. The world was breaking, fracturing into pieces that refused to hold together. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The air itself seemed thick and unyielding, as if swallowing my voice. I stumbled back toward home, desperation clawing at me. As I reached my door, the handle turned under my hand, and I stepped inside. The apartment was unchanged, except now the shadows seemed deeper, pooling in the corners like ink. I heard a faint tapping from the bedroom. I froze, listening. The tapping became a slow, deliberate knocking. I moved toward the door, each step heavy and uncertain. I opened it slowly. The room was empty. But the window was wide open, letting in a cold breeze that carried the same metallic scent I had noticed that morning. I closed the window and turned, my eyes catching sight of the desk. On it lay a single sheet of paper that hadn't been there before. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The note was typed, the words perfectly aligned and chillingly simple. Reality is not a constant. It is a variable, and you are inside the equation. I dropped the paper, my mind spinning. The room around me shifted subtly. The walls seemed to pulse, the floor beneath my feet breathing softly, as if alive. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was trapped in a world where nothing was fixed, everything was uncertain. And the silent watchers waited, their eyes never blinking, waiting for me to slip further into the cracks of this disintegrating reality. I woke to the scraping sound again, only this time it was closer. There was no mistaking it, the slow, deliberate scraping of something hard and blunt against the wooden floorboards beneath my bed. My heart hammered in my chest as I forced myself to stay still, not daring to breathe too loudly or move a muscle. The darkness in the room was different now, thinner somehow, as if the air itself had been peeled back and replaced by a shadow that shifted just at the edges of my vision. When I finally gathered the courage to glance down, I saw something that made my stomach twist, a single, pale finger poking out from under the bed. It wasn't human, too long and too smooth, with an unnatural bend that made my skin crawl. The finger twitched once, twice, and then withdrew. I scrambled backward, knocking over the lamp on my nightstand. The light flickered wildly before dying altogether, plunging the room into a darkness so complete it felt like swallowing night itself. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. I fumbled for my phone on the floor, my fingers trembling as I finally managed to ignite its flashlight. The beam sliced through the murk, landing on the gap beneath the bed. Nothing there now, just the familiar dust bunnies and discarded lint. But the unease didn't fade. The feeling that the room was no longer the same when I had gone to bed and lingered with a heavy weight. I exhaled shakily and stood, moving toward the door. My steps echoed unnaturally loud, and as I reached for the knob, the floor beneath me shifted abruptly. The wood warped, like wet paper curling at the edges, and I stumbled backwards, catching myself against the wall. For a moment, I considered sitting down and waiting it out, but the quiet was a lie. My mind raced with questions that had no answers. How long had that finger been there? Had I imagined it? Or was reality itself unraveling around me? The room felt like a poorly tuned film, flickering in and out of focus, catching glimpses of something just beyond comprehension. I forced the door open and fled into the hallway. The air was colder here, and a strange metallic scent hummed faintly like rusted iron. The hallway looked familiar but wrong. The peeling wallpaper was now smooth plaster, the faded light fixtures replaced with something modern and clinical. I blinked, and the wall shifted again, this time revealing a long corridor lined with doors I had never seen before in this apartment building. I pressed my palm against the nearest door and it swung open silently. Inside was a room bathed in a sickly yellow light, walls lined with shelves full of jars. I stepped closer, shining my phone's light over them. The jars contained strange things, twisted roots, preserved insects, odd lumps of fur and bone. One jar held what looked like a small, misshapen doll, its face cracked and smeared with dark stains. I felt the floor tremble beneath me and froze. The door behind me slammed shut, locking itself. Panic welled up again, sharp and immediate. I banged on the door, my knuckles raw, shouting for help that would never come. The jars seemed to watch me, silent witnesses to a secret I wasn't meant to uncover. After what felt like hours, the door creaked open slowly. I bolted out without hesitation, the hallway now bathed in an unnatural blue light. The apartment building around me had morphed once more. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, the walls narrowing and twisting as I hurried down the corridor, searching for an exit that refused to appear. Each door I tried opened to a different nightmare. One room was empty except for a mirror reflecting a version of me that didn't move. Another was filled with thick fog that muffled all sound. Yet another had a floor of cracked tile that seemed to ripple beneath my feet like water. I realized then that I was trapped in some kind of loop, a fractured reality folding in on itself, each version slightly off, each corridor leading into another variation of this place. I wanted to scream, to break something, to anchor myself in anything real, but the fear numbed me into silence. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time had lost meaning. My phone's battery died, plunging me into darkness deeper than before. I sat on the cold floor, breathing shallowly, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was this a dream? A hallucination? A punishment? None of it mattered if I never escaped. Then, from somewhere far away, I heard it, a voice. Not my own, not anyone I knew. It was soft, almost a whisper, but clear enough to make my blood run cold. "You're not supposed to be here." The words echoed through the halls, repeating, fading, then growing louder. I didn't know whether to run toward the voice or away from it, but frozen in place, my mind raced through every story, every horror I'd ever heard. This was no ordinary haunting. This was something else entirely, something that could bend reality itself to trap me. With nothing else left to lose, I stood and moved toward the voice, each step feeling heavier, as if the building itself resisted my advance. The walls pulsed, shadows stretching and contracting like breathing lungs. I could feel the weight of every wrong turn, every fragmented scene pressing down on me. When I reached the source of the voice, I found a door unlike the others. It was old wood, scarred and worn, with a rusted handle that felt impossibly cold. I hesitated, hand trembling as I turned the knob. The room beyond was empty, except for a single chair in the center, facing away from me. On the backrest was carved a simple phrase, "Choose." I swallowed hard, stepping inside. The air was thick, suffocating, like the final breath before drowning. I sat, heart pounding, staring at nothing, waiting for whatever came next. The reality around me flickered again, becoming something new, something more terrifying. And then the chair shifted under me, as if someone invisible had taken the seat beside me. My breath caught. I wasn't alone. The voice spoke again, inches from my ear, cold and certain, "Choose the truth, or remain lost." I closed my eyes, swallowed my fear, and in the darkness of that room, I made my choice. Story 5, Whispers of the Unseen Path. I didn't notice the change at first. It was subtle, so gradual that I almost convinced myself it was just my imagination playing tricks. That kind of thing happens when you're exhausted and stressed, or when you spend too much time alone. But when the world started blinking out of sync with itself, I had no choice but to admit something was wrong. It began on an ordinary Thursday. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the one with the chipped corner and stained surface from years of spilled coffee. The light was fading outside, thin beams filtering through the dusty window. I was scrolling through my phone, absent-mindedly, when I looked up and noticed the clock on the wall. It had stopped. The hands were frozen at 5:42. The second hand didn't move. I reached out to touch it, thinking maybe the battery was dead. But the clock was plugged in, humming softly like it always did. I frowned, glancing at my phone again. It said 5:55. I looked back at the clock. Still 5:42. I blinked and looked again. Still 5:42. Unease started to creep in, the kind that feels like a chill sliding down your spine on a hot day. I stood up, walked closer, and tapped the glass. Nothing. Then I turned around and checked my watch. 5:55. When I looked back at the clock, it was suddenly 5:43. The hands had jerked forward by 1 minute in a way that didn't feel right, like a skipped frame in a broken film reel. I shook my head and sat back down, the uneasiness gnawing at me. Maybe the clock was just malfunctioning. Maybe it wasn't real. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Something was off. The next morning, as I poured coffee from the old pot into my favorite mug, I noticed the mug was different. Not in shape or color, but in the design. The dog I was sure was printed on it yesterday was now a cat. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and blinked again. The cat was definitely there. I checked the other mugs in the cabinet. All the same as before except this one. It was an odd little shift, but it was enough to make me pause. I told myself it was probably just my mind playing tricks. Stress, fatigue, the usual suspects. I went through my day trying to ignore the creeping sensation that reality was not as stable as I thought. But then the changes started coming faster. At work, I sat at my desk staring at a document when the text rearranged itself mid-sentence. Words swapped places, sentences twisted into nonsense, then snapped back to normal when I looked away and looked back again. My coworkers were there, typing and talking as usual. I asked a colleague if she'd seen anything strange, but she looked at me as if I was losing my mind. On the subway ride home, I noticed the station names flashing inconsistently on the electronic sign. It would say Central Park, then jump to Broadway, then revert to Central Park again, faster than any train could have passed those stops. The other passengers looked bored or tired, not confused. Was I the only one seeing this? When I got off at my usual stop, I looked up at the sky and saw colors bleeding where they shouldn't be, orange merging into green, then dissolving into a dull gray. The clouds formed odd shapes that flickered like static on a television screen. I felt dizzy and gripped the railing for support. That was when I realized something fundamental. The world around me wasn't consistent. It wasn't following the laws I'd trusted my entire life. The fabric of reality was fraying, and I was watching it unravel. Back in my apartment, I tried to ground myself. I called my sister, hoping for some rational explanation. She answered cheerfully, but when I asked if she'd noticed anything strange, she said everything was fine. Maybe she didn't want to worry me, or maybe she truly didn't see anything unusual. The doubt gnawed at me. I spent the night trying to document the inconsistencies in a journal, but every time I looked at my notes, the ink seemed to smear, the words shifting position. When I closed the book, the cover felt different, thicker, heavier, like a different journal entirely. I put it down in frustration. Sleep finally claimed me, but it was restless. I dreamed of a world that flickered like a broken screen, images glitching and reforming. I woke several times to the sensation that the ceiling was breathing, expanding and contracting slowly. The next day, I made a list of every odd occurrence I could recall. Clocks freezing, mugs changing, text rearranging, signs flickering, skies bleeding color, notebooks warping. I showed the list to a friend, but he laughed it off as stress or hallucinations. I was alone in seeing it. Alone in living it. By the third day, the changes became more aggressive. My apartment rearranged itself. Doors appeared where there were none before. The hallway to my bedroom stretched and shrank unpredictably. I opened my closet to find shelves where shoes used to be, then blinked and it was empty again. The light switches moved around the walls when I wasn't looking. I stopped trusting my senses. I stopped trusting my memory. If the world could change randomly, what was real? What was permanent? Even my own reflection in the mirror didn't look right. It smiled at me once when I didn't feel like smiling. I began to feel like a character trapped in a story where the author kept rewriting the lines. Each day was a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit and edges that bled into nothing. I tried to leave the apartment, but the building seemed to twist itself into a maze. Hallways looped back on themselves, doors led to rooms I'd never seen before, or just to brick walls. I felt the walls close in. The windows offered views of impossible landscapes, streets made of glass, skies filled with floating islands, faces watching me from the shadows. The city outside my window flickered between versions, some familiar, some utterly alien. It was terrifying but also exhilarating in a way I couldn't explain. I was living in a world that refused to obey logic or reason. I was a passenger on a journey with no destination, in a vehicle that didn't follow roads or rules. I didn't know how or why it was happening. I didn't know if it would ever stop. All I knew was that reality was broken, and I was trapped inside the cracks. I woke up with a dry mouth and a strange heaviness pressing down on my chest. The room was unnervingly quiet, but not in the way a house that simply still can be. It felt like the silence itself was waiting, watching. I blinked slowly and tried to orient myself, but something was off. The shadows in the corners didn't settle right, They flickered, not with light but with something like static, as if the edges of reality were fraying. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and my feet touched the floor, cold and gritty beneath my palms as I pushed myself up. The air smelled wrong. Not stale, not musty, just wrong. Metallic, with a faint trace of burnt wire. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I must still be half asleep. But then I noticed the clock. It was an old analog one, the kind that ticked loudly, but the hands were spinning backward fast, jerky, like they were trying to undo something. I stared at it, heart beating harder, but the numbers kept rewinding past times that didn't make sense. It was 3:17 a.m., then 2:54, then 1:03. I didn't feel like I'd been asleep for hours, but the clock insisted. I pulled on my shirt and made my way out into the hall. The house was empty, no creaks, no hum of the heater, no distant sounds from outside. I expected the usual morning sunlight to be filtering in by now, but the windows were dark. As I passed the living room, I caught a glimpse of myself in the TV screen, but there was something wrong with the reflection. My eyes were hollow, and my face flickered, almost like a bad signal on an old television. I blinked and it was gone. I tried the front door. Locked, but it wasn't the lock I remembered. It was a heavy deadbolt I was sure wasn't there before. I rattled it, but it held firm. I tried the back door, and it too was sealed shut. Panic began to prick at my nerves. I checked my phone, no service, dead battery, as if it had never been charged. No messages, no calls. I was completely cut off. I retreated to the kitchen, hoping for some kind of explanation or at least a familiar object to ground me. The fridge rattled when I opened it, but the inside was empty save for a single piece of paper folded neatly on the middle shelf. I unfolded it carefully. The handwriting was my own, but the words made no sense. You are not here. You are not there. You are between. Wait. The sentence looped in my mind like a broken record. I looked around, half expecting someone to be there, but I was alone. Or so I thought. I turned to the window and saw the street outside. But it was different. The houses were the same, but their colors were all inverted bright colors dulled into strange pastels, cars moving backwards up the street, a man walking a dog that looked like a shadow with teeth. The sky was a dull, sickly green. The static flickering returned, this time around the edges of the window frame. I shook my head, trying to clear the fog creeping into my mind, but the flickering grew more erratic, like reality was glitching in and out. I sat down heavily at the kitchen table, my palms pressed against the cold wood. That note, you are not here. You are not there. You are between. Wait. It was a riddle, or maybe a warning. But what was I supposed to wait for? I glanced at the clock on the wall. It was gone. Only silence remained. I tried to calm myself, to reason through the chaos. Perhaps it was a dream? But the texture of the world was too vivid, too tactile to be mere sleep. I pinched myself hard. The pain was sharp, real. Then I heard it. A soft, insistent tapping coming from the hallway beyond the kitchen. It was rhythmic, deliberate. I stood and edged toward the sound, heart hammering against my ribs. The tapping grew louder as I neared the living room. I stopped at the doorway. The source was the large mirror hung on the wall opposite the couch. The frame was ornate and gilded, but the glass was cracked, spiderwebbed in a pattern that seemed to pulse. The tapping continued, but now it was coming from inside the mirror. I reached out tentatively, fingers trembling. The surface rippled like water. I jerked back, breath caught in my throat. Then the mirror's surface flickered, and I caught a glimpse of something, a hallway, but not the one in my house. This hallway was dim, lined with doors that I didn't recognize, stretching infinitely in both directions. At the far end, a figure stood, facing away. Tall, indistinct, draped in shadows. The figure turned slowly, revealing a face that was impossibly familiar and yet unreadable. It smiled, but the smile didn't reach the eyes. Then the mirror shattered inward, the glass cracking inward like a curtain being pulled aside, and I recoiled. The tapping stopped. My breathing was ragged, panic rising like a tide. I backed away from the mirror and stumbled toward the kitchen door, which I'd left ajar. I pushed it open and immediately regretted it. The room beyond wasn't the kitchen anymore. The walls were slimy and slick, pulsing faintly as if alive. The floor beneath my feet seemed to shift, bending like liquid. I looked down and saw my own reflection, but it was fractured, multiplied in infinite shards, each one showing a different version of me, some terrified, some angry, some resigned. I spun around, but the door was gone. In its place was a swirling void, blacker than night. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then I heard a voice. It was mine, but distorted, echoing from all directions. Not here. Not there. Between. The void pulsed and suddenly sucked me in, cold and consuming. I woke up again. This time on the floor of my bedroom. The clock beside me was normal. The hands moved forward. The room smelled familiar, fresh coffee drifting in from the kitchen downstairs. The television was off. The window showed a calm dawn breaking. I sat up slowly, heart pounding as I tried to shake the residue of the nightmare. But then I noticed the note on my dresser. It read, "You are not awake. You are not asleep. You are between. Wait." I realized then that I wasn't trapped in a dream or a nightmare, but in a space where reality fractured randomly, folding in on itself. I was caught in the cracks, between moments, between worlds, between what was and what could be. And waiting felt like the only option, though I had no idea what I was waiting for, or if anything would come at all. I woke slowly, the sharp absence of the bed beneath me disorienting. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming, until the cold, rough surface pressed against my cheek told me otherwise. I wasn't in my room. I wasn't anywhere familiar. The air was dense, stale with a metallic tang, and the dim, flickering light above cast long, overlapping shadows that seemed to shift when I blinked. I sat up carefully, the hardness beneath me rattling with movement. I was lying on a concrete floor, surrounded by towering, featureless walls that stretched into darkness above. There was no ceiling visible, just an oppressive void. I felt a panic rising in my chest, but I pushed it down. I've learned by now not to trust my first instincts. Whatever this place was, it was not bound by any rules I understood. This was the new reality, or rather, a new version of reality, and every moment felt like I was balancing on the edge of a knife. I stood, steadying myself against the cold wall, and looked around. There was nothing but the empty, echoing chamber I was in. No doors, no windows, no signs of life or exit. The silence was almost unbearable, broken only by the faint hum of something electrical, hidden just out of sight. I tested my pockets, hoping for my phone or keys, but they were gone. Nothing. Just my clothes and the pounding rhythm of my heart. I started walking, each step swallowed by the vast emptiness. After a while, the space seemed to shift subtly, walls bending, distances stretching like the room itself was breathing, watching me. The more I moved, the more I noticed small, impossible details, a shadow crossing around a corner that didn't exist, a whisper of voices in languages I didn't recognize, and, worst of all, the sensation that I was never alone even when I couldn't see a thing. Then, when I least expected it, the world changed again. One moment I was in the concrete chamber, the next I was standing in the middle of a busy city street. Cars honked, people bustled past me, faces blurred in hurried motion. The air smelled of exhaust and street food. I could feel the ground beneath my feet, solid and familiar. For a second, relief washed over me. Maybe this was real. Maybe I had escaped. But then, as I scanned the crowd, the faces started to shift like reflections in broken glass. Their eyes glowed faintly, and their mouths moved in unison, whispering the same indecipherable word over and over. The streetlights flickered erratically, and the sky above rippled as if it were a thin sheet of fabric fluttering in a breeze I couldn't feel. The city dissolved, replaced by the silence and cold of the concrete room again. I barely caught my breath before the next shift, a bedroom, warm and dimly lit, with a single window showing a starless night sky. I recognized the room. It was mine. My real room, or at least a near-perfect facsimile. Everything was identical down to the crooked picture frame and the cracked vase on the dresser. I was almost grateful to be back until I noticed something else. On the bed lay a notebook, open to a page filled with my handwriting. But the words were wrong. They told a story I didn't remember writing, a journal entry about a man trapped in shifting realities, losing his mind to the endless labyrinth of places he couldn't control. The last line was chilling. If you read this, it's already too late. I flipped the page quickly, desperate for some explanation, but the ink was smeared and illegible. A sudden, cold breeze swept through the room, rustling the papers and making the candle flicker out. Darkness swallowed the space, and I felt something brush against my arm, a touch, but not human. I staggered back, heart hammering, and the room dissolved into blackness again. When I opened my eyes next, I was outside. The sky was a bruised purple, the sun too large and oddly colored, hanging low on the horizon. The landscape was familiar, but wrong, trees with leaves that shimmered like glass, grass that bent away from me as if alive. The air was thick, and the silence was heavy enough to suffocate. I heard a faint sound, like distant footsteps, echoing in a pattern that didn't fit the terrain. I started moving toward the sound, driven by an instinct I barely understood. The ground beneath my feet shifted with each step, solid dirt, then sand, then slick stone. Buildings appeared and vanished in the distance, sometimes close, sometimes impossibly far away. The footsteps grew louder, more deliberate, but I never caught sight of their source. There was no logic to this place. No cause and effect. Every step forward felt like a gamble. I tried calling out, but my voice was swallowed by the shifting air. It was as if the world itself refused to hold my reality steady. Suddenly, the footsteps stopped. The space around me froze, the colors fading to grayscale. I stood alone in a void, the horizon stretched into nothingness. Then, a whisper floated through the air, soft and deadly clear. "Why do you keep trying?" I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was no one. The voice was inside my head, yet it carried the coldness of something outside, watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body was rooted to the spot. "Why do you keep trying to fix it?" "To find a way back." "You belong here now." The words echoed, folding around me like a shroud. I wanted to fight, to deny it, but a part of me trembled with the possibility of truth. What if this was all I had left? What if I was already lost beyond hope? Without warning, the void shattered. I was back in the concrete chamber, gasping for air as if I'd been underwater. The hum was louder now, vibrating through the floor, through my bones. The walls seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of their own. I sank to the ground, exhausted and terrified, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I dared to admit it, I didn't know what was real anymore. The rules I clung to were gone. The world was a fractured kaleidoscope, turning endlessly with no stopping point. And somewhere, in the shifting shadows, something was waiting. Something patient. I didn't want to move, but I had to. because if I stayed still, I would disappear into the cracks of this broken reality forever. So I stood up, wiped the sweat from my brow, and stepped forward into the unknown. The morning light was weak and uneven when I woke up. The air had a strange weight to it, as if the room itself was holding its breath. I blinked against the dimness and noticed something odd right away. The clock on the wall was spinning backward. Not just ticking backward, but the hands were jerking and twisting like they were stuck in a glitch, moving in fits and starts. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was still half dreaming, but the clock kept twisting. The hallway outside my room was quiet, too quiet. I had gotten used to the faint creaks and murmurs of the old house by now, but today everything was unnervingly still. Even the usual hum of the heater was absent. I swung my legs off the bed and stood, feeling an odd disorientation in my limbs, a slight wobble in my balance. It was like waking up inside a funhouse mirror, everything familiar but just off. I decided to check the kitchen. Maybe if I could get some coffee, I could settle my nerves. But as I stepped into the hallway, the floor seemed to ripple beneath my feet, like water. I looked down, expecting to see a stain or a puddle, but there was nothing but the old wooden floorboards, splintered and dull. I shook my head, trying to focus. When I reached the kitchen, the smell was different. Instead of the usual burnt coffee lingering in the air, there was a sharp metallic tang that made my stomach twist. The sink was filled with water, although I was sure I'd turned it off the night before. Oddly, the water was perfectly still, as if frozen in time. I reached my hand toward it, and when I touched the surface, it felt thick, like jelly rather than liquid. I pulled my hand back quickly, my skin prickling. Then I heard a faint whisper, coming from the living room. It was so soft I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. I told myself it was the wind or maybe the old pipes creaking. But as I walked toward the sound, the whispering grew louder, forming words just out of reach. I strained to listen and caught a phrase, "Don't trust a mirror." I froze just inside the doorway of the living room. The mirror on the wall was there, but it didn't reflect the room as it should. Instead, it showed the same room but with subtle differences. The furniture was rearranged, the colors were inverted, and, most unsettling, there was a figure standing behind me in the reflection, a shape I couldn't see in reality. I spun around, heart racing, but the room behind me was empty. I looked back at the mirror. The figure was still there, close now, its face hidden in shadow. I reached out to touch the glass, and the surface rippled like disturbed water. The figure raised a hand and waved, then slowly mouthed, "Help me." I stumbled back, nearly knocking over a chair. The whisper returned, louder now and more urgent. I covered my ears, but the sound invaded my head, echoing and twisting my thoughts. I sank to the floor, pressing my hands against my temples, willing it to stop. After a few minutes, the whisper faded. I looked up, and the mirror showed my own reflection again, normal and clear. But the feeling of being watched didn't fade. I realized then that the house wasn't just old and creaky, it was unstable. Reality itself was bending and breaking in small, terrifying ways. I needed to get out. I grabbed my coat and keys from the table near the door, but when I tried to open it, the handle wouldn't turn. I pulled harder, panic seeping into my chest. The door was locked from the outside, or maybe it never unlocked. I looked around, searching for another exit, but every door and window seemed to be sealed, as if the house was holding me captive. I felt a cold draft and turned to see the hallway stretching endlessly into darkness, far longer than it should have been. The walls pulsated with a faint, unnatural glow, and the floor beneath me shifted again. I took a tentative step forward, then another, drawn deeper into the house's warped reality. The whispers returned, now voices in a chorus, overlapping and indecipherable. I couldn't tell if they were warning me or laughing at me. My mind reeled as the space around me distorted, doors appeared where there were none, rooms changed shape, and the ceiling seemed to stretch upward like a cavern. Suddenly, I was standing in a room I didn't recognize. The walls were lined with photographs, images of people I couldn't place. Each face was blurred, like they were fading or unfinished. In the center of the room was a chair, old and wooden, facing a small table with an unlit candle. I felt a pull toward it, a compulsion I couldn't resist. As I sat down, the candle flickered on by itself. The blurred faces in the photo sharpened for a moment, revealing expressions of fear and sorrow. I realized with a sinking feeling that these might be previous occupants of the house, people who had disappeared, trapped in this fractured reality. The whispers coalesced into a single voice, low and urgent. "Find the cracks," it said. "Fix the fractures." I looked around, heart pounding. The room began to shimmer, and the photographs started peeling off the walls like brittle wallpaper. Beneath them was a map, not of any place I knew, but a chaotic tangle of lines and shapes, as if reality itself was fractured and splintered. I traced a finger along one of the glowing cracks, and the room shifted again. Suddenly, I was outside, standing on the front lawn in bright daylight. The house loomed behind me, intact and normal-looking. I rushed to the door, which opened easily this time. Inside, everything seemed ordinary, the creaks and groans of the old house, the familiar dust motes floating in the air. But I knew better now. The cracks were everywhere, hiding beneath the surface, waiting to swallow me whole. I had to find a way to mend them before reality tore apart completely. Because if I didn't, I wouldn't be the only one trapped in this nightmare. And somewhere, in the shifting shadows, the figure in the mirror was still waiting. The shift came without warning. One moment I was sitting at the kitchen table, trying to make sense of the jumbled mess of my notes, and the next, I was standing outside, staring at a street I didn't recognize. The sky was overcast, heavy with the kind of gray that seemed to swallow sound and light alike. I blinked, disbelief clawing at my throat. How had I gotten here? The last thing I remembered was the creak of the old floorboards beneath my feet, that oppressive silence pressing in on me like a physical thing. I felt the cold bite of the wind against my skin, smelled the damp earth mingled with something faintly metallic. Concrete cracked beneath my boots, worn and patchy, the sidewalks cracked and uneven. The houses lining the street were old, their paint peeling, windows boarded up or shattered. Nothing like the neighborhood I lived in. It was a place out of time, or maybe just out of place. I tried to steady my breathing, but my heart hammered against my ribs like a desperate thing trying to escape. I moved forward, each step slow and cautious. I had to figure out where I was, or at least understand how I ended up here. But the street was deserted. No cars, no people, only the low howl of the wind slipping through the broken branches overhead. The silence was unnatural, like the world was holding its breath. It pressed into my ears, filling the space with a weight that made me dizzy. I reached a corner and turned, looking for any sign of familiarity, anything to anchor me, but the buildings only seemed to close in tighter. At the far end of the block, a faint glow caught my eye. It was a flicker, like the light of a candle or a fire trapped behind glass. I hesitated, uncertainty rising like bile in my throat, but I knew I had to investigate. The glow came from a small shop, its facade cracked and stained, the windows grimy with years of neglect. A crooked sign hung above the door, the letters faded and half missing. I struggled to read it, maybe Miller's Antiques or Miller's Antiques. The ambiguity made my stomach twist. I pressed my hand against the glass, and the chill of it sent a shiver through me. Inside, the shop was cluttered, every surface covered in layers of dust and forgotten things. The smell of old paper and rust filled the air, thick and suffocating. I reached for the door handle, and it gave way with a groan, letting me slip inside. The faint light came from a single, sputtering lamp on the counter, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. I called out, but my voice felt swallowed by the space. There was no answer. The silence returned, heavier than before. I moved deeper into the shop, my fingers trailing over the spines of ancient books and cracked leather-bound journals. Something about this place felt off, like it was waiting for me, watching me. Then I saw it, a photograph pinned to the wall behind the counter, half obscured by cobwebs. A man stood in the center, his face sharp and clear despite the years. He wore a suit that seemed too formal for the time, his eyes piercing. I stared, trying to place him, but nothing came. Then I noticed the date scrawled beneath the frame, 1983. A shuffling sound made me spin around. Nothing. Just the flicker of the lamp. My pulse quickened. I told myself it was just the wind or my imagination, but the unease wouldn't settle. I turned back to the counter and saw a small box, almost hidden beneath a pile of yellowed letters. On its surface, scratched into the wood, was a symbol I recognized from my notes, a circle broken by a jagged line. I hesitated but opened it anyway. Inside was a key, cold and heavy, with an inscription so tiny I had to squint, for the door that never closes. The words sent a ripple of dread through me. What door? Where? Suddenly, the walls seemed to pulse, the shadows deepening. The lamp flickered violently, casting the room into darkness for a split second. When the light returned, the shop had changed. The clutter was gone, replaced by a polished floor and spotless shelves. The air was warmer, the smell of dust replaced by something cleaner, sharper. I was no longer alone. A figure stood near the back, a woman in a simple dress, her face blurred, like a photograph out of focus. She turned slowly, and for a moment, her eyes locked with mine. There was a plea in them, urgent and silent. "Help me," she seemed to say. I wanted to respond, but my voice was caught in my throat. Then the shop began to dissolve around me, the walls melting into an endless void of shifting light and shadow. I gripped the key tightly, desperate for something solid to hold on to. When the world finally settled again, I was back at the kitchen table, the notes scattered before me as if nothing had happened. But I knew otherwise. The key lay in my palm, cool and real, a tangible link to the impossible. I didn't know what the door was, or how to find it. But the woman's eyes haunted me, and the key whispered of places I wasn't meant to go. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that flicker of light, felt the unrelenting pull of that shifting reality that refused to stay still. And I knew I had to find the door that never closes, or risk being lost in the spaces between worlds forever. Story 6, Fragments of a Shattered World. I never believed in anything like the randomness of reality until the night I lost control of mine. Before that, my life had an almost boring predictability: wake up, commute, work, eat, sleep. Repeat. There was comfort in routine. Understanding the patterns, knowing what to expect. But when the world around me started to shift without warning, without reason, I realized how fragile that illusion truly was. It began on a Tuesday. I had left the office later than usual, settling into the slow rhythm of the evening commute. The train car was nearly empty, the usual hum of fluorescent lights and distant chatter muted beneath the steady clatter of wheels on tracks. I was scrolling through my phone when the lights flickered and vanished, plunging the car into darkness. A collective murmur rose from the few passengers, nervous but brief. The emergency lights kicked in, casting a dim red glow that made everything seem drenched in shadow. I tried to steady my breath, telling myself it was just a power failure. Nothing more. But then, the train lurched violently, throwing me against the seat opposite. The lights returned a moment later, but the world outside the window was wrong. The familiar cityscape, buildings, streetlights, passing cars had been replaced by a vast expanse of fog. Thick, white, endless. It wasn't the usual gray mist you sometimes see in the early mornings. This was unnatural, suffocating. I looked around at the other passengers, 2 men, a woman, and a teenager. They stared out the windows, their faces pale and tight with confusion. I tried to speak, but my voice felt distant, as if trapped in a thick veil of silence that had descended upon the car. The train continued to move, but there was no sense of direction. No sound other than the wheels and the occasional groan of metal. Minutes stretched into an uncertain void. Then, suddenly, the landscape outside shifted again. The fog lifted, and instead of a city, we were speeding through a dense forest. Tall trees loomed on either side, their branches like skeletal fingers clawing at the windows. Shadows moved within the woods, shapes that didn't quite belong. I caught a glimpse of something with glowing eyes and a face that twisted into a grin before it vanished. Panic began to rise in my chest. I pressed my hands against the window, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The forest gave way to a suburban street, but the houses were distorted, walls melting, windows pulsating. The teenager near me shuddered quietly, clutching a worn backpack. The woman whispered that she recognized the place. I didn't ask how. Then the train stopped abruptly. The doors slid open to a platform bathed in an eerie, flickering light. No announcement came, no one moved except me. I stepped off, my legs shaky, onto concrete that seemed to ripple beneath my feet like water. The platform stretched endlessly in both directions, disappearing into darkness. Somewhere, distant and muffled, I heard a child crying. Or maybe it was laughter. I couldn't tell. I walked forward, drawn by a strange compulsion. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, blood, maybe, or rust. I passed doorways carved into the platform walls, each leading to places that shifted as I glanced at them. One moment a cozy kitchen with sunlight pouring in, the next, a sterile hospital corridor lined with flickering monitors. The scenes flickered so rapidly I couldn't focus. A voice whispered behind me, a woman's voice, soft and close. I spun around, but no one was there. The cry I had heard earlier grew louder, echoing through the endless platform. I called out, but my words were swallowed by the oppressive atmosphere. I found myself drawn toward one particular doorway that pulsed with a strange light. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, the cold metal biting into my skin. When I stepped inside, I was no longer on the platform but standing in my apartment. It was exactly how I left it that morning. The same mess on the kitchen table, the same half-finished cup of coffee on the counter. I moved through the rooms, but the silence was suffocating. My phone lay on the couch, the screen was dead. I pressed the power button repeatedly, but it stayed black. Then I heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from the bedroom. I froze. No one was supposed to be there. Slowly, I crept toward the door, heart hammering. As I turned the knob, the footsteps stopped. The room was empty. But the mirror above the dresser was cracked, jagged lines spiderwebbing across the glass. I stared at my reflection, but my eyes looked back with an unfamiliar coldness. Something was wrong. The air behind me shifted, as if breathing. I spun around again, and a dark shape flickered at the edge of my vision. I blinked, and it was gone. That's when I realized I wasn't alone. Not really. The boundaries of my reality had fractured, splitting into shards I couldn't hold together. The train, the platform, my apartment, they were all pieces of a puzzle I didn't understand. And I was trapped somewhere in between. As the night deepened, the shifting scenes around me became more erratic. Walls melted into endless voids, voices whispered in languages I couldn't comprehend, shadows twisted into forms both human and monstrous. The more I tried to find solid ground, the more it slipped away. I tried to sleep, but my bed was a boat adrift on a sea of static. I felt the sensation of falling, tumbling through layers of space that didn't obey logic or time. When I closed my eyes, I saw flashes, memories that weren't mine, places I'd never been, people who looked through me with vacant eyes. By morning, I was exhausted and disoriented. I stepped outside, hoping to find normalcy. The street was there, but distorted. Trees grew upside down. Cars drove backwards. The sky was a patchwork of day and night. I realized then that randomness wasn't just a phenomenon, it was a force. A reality unbound by rules, cruel in its indifference. And I was caught in its endless chaos. There was no telling what would come next. I was no longer sure if I was awake or dreaming, alive or something else entirely. The steady beat of my heart was the only anchor left in a world gone mad. And somewhere deep inside, I knew this was only the beginning. The morning light seeped in through the cracked blinds, but it did nothing to reassure me. I lay there for a long time, the events of the previous night swirling relentlessly in my mind. The shadows in my room didn't behave as they should. They flickered and shifted, briefly forming impossible shapes. I had to convince myself it was just my imagination playing tricks after a restless night, but something about it felt wrong. More than wrong, it was as if reality itself had gone off script, stumbling mid-scene. I tried to stand, but my legs trembled beneath me. The air tasted stale and thick, and the faint hum of the city outside sounded distorted, oddly out of sync with the rhythm of my heart. I reached for my phone on the nightstand, hoping for a lifeline to normalcy, but the screen was black. Not off, dead. I pressed the power button again and again, but it was unresponsive. A cold knot tightened in my stomach. I stepped toward the window to get some fresh air, but the hallway outside felt elongated, impossibly long for such a small apartment building. The faint hum of my neighbor's TV echoed down the hall, but it twisted like a warped melody. I shook my head, trying to clear the creeping unease that felt like a weight pulling me down. I opened the window, and the cool air brushed against my face, sharp and real, but outside the street below, cars were parked where they shouldn't be. The city, which I knew well, was subtly wrong. A stop sign stood twisted like a bent tooth, and the graffiti on the brick walls was in languages I had never seen before. I pulled back from the ledge and closed the window. That's when I realized I didn't know what day it was anymore. My calendar was stuck on last week. I ran to my desk, grabbed the notebook where I normally kept appointments, but the dates were jumbled, out of order. Yesterday's notes were written in the future, and the pages in between were blank or smeared, as if someone had erased the days. I tried to call my best friend, Mara. Her voice was the one thing I trusted to tether me to reality. The line rang endlessly, and then a weird static took over. It wasn't the usual crackle, it sounded like a whisper, but I couldn't make out the words. I slammed the phone down, heart hammering. I needed to get out of the apartment, to find some sign that the world outside still made sense. I grabbed my coat and keys, stepping into the hallway. I had to make it to the corner cafe that was my usual sanctuary, the one place where things felt solid. But the hallway stretched on, longer than before, the fluorescent lights flickering in a slow, irregular pulse. I noticed the paint peeling in strange patterns, almost like symbols. I tried to focus on counting my steps, but my mind kept slipping, thoughts fracturing, memories overlapping. When I finally reached the street, the sun was high, but the shadows cast by the buildings were inconsistent. One side of the street had shadows falling west, the other east. People passed by me, but their faces seemed to blur at the edges, like grainy reflections. I called out to a man walking nearby, but when he turned, his eyes were completely black, like empty pits. I blinked, and suddenly his face was normal again, as if nothing had happened. Fear rooted me to the sidewalk. This wasn't just a bad dream or a moment of exhaustion. Something was unraveling, something fundamental. I tried to remember if I'd taken any medication, or if I was sick, but nothing in my routine fit this. My chest tightened with a gripping dread as I realized I had no idea what was real anymore. I forced myself to move toward the cafe. Inside, the familiar scent of coffee and old wood should have been comforting, but it was too quiet. I looked around. The barista was behind the counter, but her movements were slow, jerky, and she didn't register my presence. I walked up to the counter and tried to order, but the words got tangled in my throat. When she finally looked at me, her eyes weren't eyes at all, just swirling darkness. I stumbled out of the cafe, panic rising. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out, and the screen flickered to life, a message from an unknown number. "You're awake." Good. My fingers trembled as I typed back, "Who's this?" The reply came instantly, "Watch carefully. Reality is fragile." I shoved the phone into my coat and started walking, trying to make sense of it all. Everything veered between normal and impossible. I passed a park where the swings moved on their own, creaking softly like whispers. Children played under a sky streaked with stars, even though it was midday. One child turned to me and smiled, but the smile stretched impossibly wide, teeth sharpened like a predator's. I blinked, and he was gone. I found myself back at my apartment building before I knew it, heart pounding. My legs moved on their own, as if some unseen force was guiding me home. The door was open. I remember locking it. I pushed it further and stepped inside. The apartment was darker than I left it, colder too. The air smelled like burnt paper. On my kitchen table lay an envelope, sealed with no name or address. I ripped it open. Inside was a single photo, one I had never seen before. It was a picture of me, asleep in my own bed, but behind me stood a shadowy figure, just beyond the edge of the frame. I dropped the photo and it fluttered to the floor. The lights flickered, the whispering returned, louder now, filling the rooms with unintelligible murmurs. I wrapped my arms around myself, trying to block it out. The room began to shift, walls bending, ceiling stretching away. I pressed my back against the cold wall and closed my eyes. When I opened them again, everything was still. The apartment looked normal, as if nothing had happened. But I knew better. That fragile veil had torn, and I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't name or control. I sank to the floor, tears stinging my eyes. I didn't know what awaited me, but I had no choice but to face it. Reality was no longer reliable, it was a shifting maze, and I was trapped in the middle. And somewhere, out there, the whispering waited. I woke up to the sound of something tapping against the window. My eyes snapped open, heart already pounding as if I'd been running. The room was bathed in a strange half-light, the kind that felt neither night nor day. I wasn't sure how long I'd slept, but the air was cool, and the blinds twitched in a breeze I hadn't felt before. The tapping stopped. I sat up and stared at the window, but the glass was foggy, streaked with condensation, and I couldn't see through it clearly. I must have dozed off again, I thought, rubbing my face. The tapping had been faint, almost impatient. I felt a creeping unease, like something was trying to get in or get out. The world around me still felt off, like I was caught between two realities, neither fully tangible nor completely imagined. I stood and crossed the room to the window, pulling the blinds aside cautiously. Outside, the street was empty and still, gray buildings looming like forgotten monuments. No one was there. No movement, no sounds except the distant hum of traffic, muffled and unnatural. The sky was an impossible shade of pale green, as if the sun were filtered through some unseen prism. When I turned back into the room, everything seemed subtly different. The furniture was arranged slightly out of place, the book on the nightstand was upside down. It was the same room I had gone to sleep in, but something about it felt wrong, like I had stepped into a memory that wasn't quite mine. I tried to steady my breath. I had to get out. I grabbed my coat and keys, stepping into the hallway that stretched longer than it should have. The walls were lined with doors I didn't recognize, their numbers flickering and changing as I walked past them. The elevator at the end of the hall hummed quietly, its buttons glowing erratically. I pressed the button for the lobby, but instead of the elevator moving down, the doors slid open to reveal a pitch-black void. A cold wave of panic swept over me. I slammed the doors shut and backed away, heart racing. I wasn't sure if the elevator was broken or if it was something else entirely, some glitch in the fabric of this reality that I was trapped in. I turned to the stairwell, deciding to take the stairs down. The steps creaked underfoot, and the dim emergency lighting flickered sporadically. As I descended, I noticed the walls were covered with writing, scratches and scribbles etched into the paint. At first, I didn't understand the words. They twisted and shifted as I tried to read them, like the letters were alive. Then they settled into phrases: "You don't belong, this isn't real, turn back before it's too late." A shiver ran down my spine. I tried to dismiss it as someone's prank, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I reached the lobby, which was empty except for an old payphone in the corner, its receiver hanging loose and the cord tangled. I picked up the receiver. Silence, then a faint static, then a voice. It was garbled at first, but then clear enough to understand. "Help me." I dropped the phone, startled. The voice was my own. My breathing caught as I stared at the phone, unable to rationalize what I had just heard. The lobby doors were locked tight. I pushed them hard, but they wouldn't budge. I was trapped. Then the lights flickered and went out completely. The darkness pressed in, thick and suffocating. In the blackness, I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, approaching. I reached for my phone, but it was dead. No signal, no power. The footsteps stopped just behind me. "Who's there?" I whispered, voice trembling. Silence. Then a cold breath brushed against my ear, and a voice, not mine, whispered, "You're already inside." I spun around, but there was nothing. Only the darkness, endless and consuming. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. The reality around me was unraveling, shifting in impossible ways. The floor beneath me rippled like water, the walls breathing in and out. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, but when I opened them, the lobby was gone. I found myself standing on a street that shouldn't exist, a twisted mirror of the city outside my apartment. The sky was a dull orange, the buildings leaning at impossible angles. People walked past me, faces blurred and indistinct, murmuring in voices I couldn't understand. I tried to call out, to ask where I was, but my words were swallowed by the air. I noticed a shop window nearby with a reflection that wasn't mine. Instead, I saw a man staring back at me, eyes wide with the same fear I felt. He raised a hand, as if to warn me. Then the image blinked out. Panic surged through me. I stumbled forward, desperately searching for something solid, anything familiar. The city shifted beneath my feet, streets changing direction, buildings stretching and contracting like living things. I realized I was no longer just trapped in a place, I was trapped within the very rules of reality itself, which bent and fractured at random. Suddenly, the ground opened beneath me, and I fell. I braced for impact, but instead of hitting the hard pavement, I landed softly on something cold and wet. I looked up. The sky was gone. I was in a dimly lit room filled with mirrors, each reflecting different versions of me, some smiling, some screaming, some crying. The reflections moved independently, acting out fragments of memories and fears. One mirror showed me standing in my childhood home, alone and terrified. Another reflected a future I didn't recognize, older and broken. I stumbled toward the exit, which was just another mirror. I reached out and touched the glass, but instead of hard surface, it rippled like water. My hand plunged through. I fell again, landing in my apartment. The lights flickered back on, the window tapping was gone, and everything seemed normal for a moment. Then my phone buzzed. A message. Just one word, welcome. I didn't know who had sent it or what it meant, but I understood the truth instinctively. I wasn't simply lost. I was caught in a shifting nightmare where reality itself was unreliable, a place where nothing was stable or certain. And worse, I was alone. The clock on the wall ticked backward, seconds unraveling into oblivion as I sat frozen, waiting for the next fracture to open beneath me. I woke with a start, my breath catching in my throat, heart hammering like it wanted to break free from my chest. The room was the same as I remembered, four cracked walls, a narrow window half shielded by peeling blinds, and the musty scent of old wood and damp plaster. But something felt off. It wasn't the room itself, it was me. I blinked several times, trying to ground myself in the reality I thought I knew, but the edges blurred, as though the walls were breathing, flexing just out of sight. The clock on the nightstand ticked, but the numbers shifted with every glance. One moment it read 3:17, the next 4:02, then back again, like time itself was losing patience with my presence. I sat up slowly, every movement weighted by a growing unease. My fingers brushed the bedside table, and I noticed a small notebook I hadn't seen before. It was bound in faded leather, corners worn smooth by frequent handling. With a hesitant hand, I opened it. The pages were filled with hurried, scrawled writing. At first, the words made no sense, sentences jumbled, letters reversed, words overlapping in a chaotic pattern. But as I stared, the text began to reorganize, aligning into readable fragments. The entries were dated, but the dates seemed impossible. Tomorrow's date, yesterday's, and some that read as years ahead or behind. The handwriting wasn't mine, yet the description struck a familiar chord. One passage caught my eye. They are here, shifting the world like a kaleidoscope. What was solid melts into question. I am the observer, but the scene rewrites itself before my eyes. Trust no memory. Trust no moment. A chill crept over me. I slammed the notebook shut and looked around the room. The shadows seemed thicker now, pooling in corners where light should have reached. The window rattled faintly, though the air was still. I forced myself to stand. Each step toward the door felt like wading through water, resistance in every movement. I touched the doorknob, it was ice cold. The hallway beyond was pitch black, but I could hear a faint sound, like a whisper just beyond comprehension. I strained to listen. The voices were indistinct but persistent, forming an unintelligible murmur that made my skin crawl. A sudden flicker in the hallway caught my eye. I turned sharply. For a brief moment, I saw figures, shadowy, shifting silhouettes just beyond the doorway. Then they vanished, leaving nothing but a void where something had been. My pulse quickened, adrenaline flooding my system. I backed into the room, slamming the door shut behind me. I leaned against it, gasping for calm as the whispers outside faded. My mind raced. What was happening? Had I slipped into some fever dream, or was this the new reality? The notebook's warning echoed in my head, trust no memory. Trust no moment. I sat back down on the bed, trying to collect myself. The room's atmosphere thickened, as if the walls themselves were closing in. Then, almost imperceptibly, the ceiling above me shimmered, like a heat haze on a summer day. I reached up hesitantly, fingers brushing the surface. The plaster felt wet, pulsing beneath my skin. I peeled away a small patch, expecting dust or crumbled debris, but found a mirror beneath. I jerked back, heart pounding. The mirror wasn't reflecting the room, it showed another place entirely. A dense forest at twilight, shadows stretching long and strange among twisted trees. I leaned closer, mesmerized by the shifting scene, and suddenly the glass rippled like water. The forest seemed to breathe, and then a figure appeared, a woman, her face pale and eyes hollow, staring directly at me. I yanked my hand away and the mirror vanished, replaced once more by cracked plaster. My mind screamed for reason. Was it hallucination? Some trick of light? But the intensity of the encounter felt too real, too vivid to dismiss. I needed answers, but every instinct screamed that there were none to be found here. Not yet. I glanced again at the notebook, its pages seemingly calmer now, words settling into neat lines. Another entry caught my eye. Reality fractures. Each choice, a prism of possibilities. The world splits, folds, repeats. Where do I end? Where does the nightmare begin? I shivered, feeling the weight of the unknown pressing down on me. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating. I longed for a sign, some anchor to the truth of what was happening. Then, without warning, the room shifted. The walls blurred and remade themselves into a familiar space, a kitchen, bright and sterile, with sunlight pouring through large windows. A kettle whistled softly on the stove. I blinked, disoriented, but the smell of boiling water was real, tangible. My heart slowed, hope flickering. Maybe this was a memory. A place I had been before. I moved toward the stove, reaching for the kettle. My hand passed through it like smoke. The warmth vanished, replaced by an icy chill. The kitchen dissolved, replaced by the cracked room once more. I was back, trapped in the shifting nightmare. A whisper brushed my ear, soft, urgent, impossible to place. It said a single word, remember. I closed my eyes, searching my mind for what to hold on to. But the memories fractured and scattered like shards of broken glass. Faces blurred, places melted, moments twisted until nothing was certain. The reality I had trusted was gone, replaced by an endless loop of distortions. I sank to the floor, breath ragged, the notebook clutched tightly in my hands. Somewhere beyond this madness, I needed to find the truth. But with every step, the world folded anew, and the line between nightmare and reality grew ever thinner. I woke with a start, heart hammering so loud it felt as though someone else could hear it from across the room. The darkness around me was thick and absolute, but something was off, something about the air. It wasn't the stale heaviness I was used to in that old house, but a peculiar sharpness, like the moment just before a storm breaks. I blinked, struggling to orient myself. The bed beneath me was unfamiliar, the sheets rougher than I remembered. For a moment, I thought I might have slept somewhere else entirely. The clock on the small nightstand was missing, replaced instead by a cracked mirror that distorted the dim light leaking in from the door crack. I sat up slowly, feeling the mattress shift beneath me. The room smelled faintly of burnt wood and something metallic, like old blood. I scanned the walls, hoping to catch a familiar landmark, something to reassure me that I was still where I thought I was. But the wallpaper was different, a dull floral print with splotches of peeling paint that revealed moldy plaster underneath. The window was half open, letting in a cold draft that made the curtains shudder slightly. I stood and crossed to the window, pressing my palm against the glass. Outside, the world looked normal at first. Branches swayed in the wind, a car passed down the street, but then the sidewalk jerked out of alignment, the cracks shifting and warping like ripples on water. I blinked hard. The effect lasted only a moment before the pavement returned to its usual straightness. I shook my head. My mind was playing tricks again. The episodes had started a few days ago, after I'd found that journal buried beneath the floorboards in the attic. Each time I read a passage aloud, reality seemed to fray at the edges, fracturing and twisting in ways that defied explanation. At first, it was just small things, a clock running backwards, shadows that didn't match their owners, but now it was creeping into my waking life, unbidden and terrifying. I pulled on my jacket and stepped into the hallway, my footsteps echoing down the narrow corridor. The house felt different, the walls groaned under some invisible weight, and the air was colder than I could account for. As I passed the kitchen, I noticed the peeling wallpaper from the bedroom had somehow crept into this space too. The floral pattern was everywhere, a sickly yellow that made my skin crawl. I reached the front door and twisted the knob, but it wouldn't budge. Panic prickled at the backs of my eyes. I tugged harder, banging my fists against the wood. The house seemed to be holding me captive. I took a breath and told myself this had to be a trick of the mind, some surreal nightmare I could wake from. With no other option, I turned back inside. The hallway stretched interminably, the walls elongating as if the house itself was breathing. At the far end, the doorway to the living room flickered, like a broken television screen. I hesitated but felt an irresistible pull towards it. Stepping through, I found the room was cluttered with objects I didn't recognize: old photographs, faded letters, a rusted lantern. The air smelled of damp earth and something else, something acrid that curled the back of my tongue. I knelt to pick up a photo. The image was hazy but familiar. A family portrait, all smiles frozen in time. I traced the faces with a trembling finger, feeling a terrible sense of déjà vu. Suddenly, a whisper brushed the edge of my hearing, unintelligible yet urgent. I snapped my head around. The room was empty. The whispering persisted, growing louder, merging into a low hum that filled the space. I covered my ears, but the sound penetrated deeper than sound should, vibrating in my bones. Then the room shifted again. The walls rippled, the floor tilting beneath me. I stumbled, catching myself on a broken table. The photographs scattered, pages of letters fluttering like trapped birds. The whispers morphed into cries, then screams, all rushing at once in a cruel cacophony. I shut my eyes, willing it to stop. When I opened them, the room was still. The photographs lay strewn on the floor, but the faces in the pictures had changed. They were no longer smiling. Their eyes, once warm, were now hollow pits, staring straight at me with an accusing emptiness. I backed away, heart in my throat. The door behind me slammed shut. I reached for the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The room began to darken, shadows pooling in the corners and spreading like oil. My breath came in ragged gasps as the air grew colder, the whispers returning, this time as distinct voices. "We are here," they said, waiting. A cold sweat broke out across my skin. I tried to speak, to ask who they were, but no sound came. The voices circled me, overlapping and overlapping until they became a single, unbearable scream. Then everything stopped. The light returned in a flash. I was back in my bedroom, lying on the same bed I had woken up in, the rough sheets scratching my skin. The cracked mirror was gone, replaced again by the familiar clock ticking steadily on the nightstand. I sat up, breathless, trying to shake off the nightmare. Had it been a dream, or was it something else? The line between waking and sleep had blurred beyond recognition. The journal lay open on the floor beside the bed, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. I reached for it, my fingers tracing the inked words that seemed to shift and swim under my gaze. A new sentence had appeared. Reality is not fixed. We are the fractures. I felt a chill settle deep inside me. I didn't understand what was happening anymore. The house, the voices, the shifting walls, they were all real, or at least real enough to tear apart my sanity. The only certainty I had left was that whatever I had unleashed by reading that journal was still here. Watching me. Waiting for me to break. I closed the book and stood, moving toward the door. This time, it opened without resistance. The hallway stretched before me, just as it had before, but the wallpaper was gone, replaced by pristine white walls that gleamed unnaturally. I stepped into the corridor, and with every step, the world around me pulsed and shimmered, as though reality itself was a fragile veneer, cracking and reforming beneath my feet. I wasn't sure if I was still inside the house or trapped inside my own unraveling mind. Either way, the fractures had begun, and there was no telling where they would lead or if I would survive the journey.